From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to Coast AM. Next hour, it's called Disinformation, how they're trying to undermine us. Fascinating program. Happy birthday, America, 237 years old. Doesn't seem that old for a country, does it? We've sure done a lot in 237 years. And I hope we have many more great things to accomplish. Happy birthday. Throughout the night, we'll be doing some special Independence Day things for you. Here's what's happening in Egypt. They are swearing in one, throwing out the other. The top judge of Egypt's constitutional court, Adli Momo Moussad, has been sworn in as the interim leader a day after the army ousted President Muammar Morsi and put him under house arrest. Mr. Moussad said that fresh elections were the only way to move forward, but gave no indication of when they would be held. Morsi, on the other hand, Egypt's first freely elected leader, is under house arrest after what he says was a military coup. Well, I believe that's probably what it was. The army said that he had failed to meet the demands of the people, and according to all those demonstrators, I would say that's the case too. The upheaval comes after days of mass rallies against Morsi and the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood movement that he comes from. A man infected with the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus has died in a UK hospital. The patient, who is 49 years old, was being treated for kidney failure and acute respiratory syndrome. He was flown to St. Thomas Hospital in London from Qatar in September of last year. There have now been 41 reported deaths from this virus, which emerged last year and is similar to those that cause SARS and the common cold. What is scaring people, as I've mentioned before, is the high fatality rate that's tied into this. A deeply religious Wisconsin couple who prayed over their dying daughter rather than seek medical help were properly convicted of homicide, according to its state Supreme Court. Karen Newman, 11 years old, of Weston, Wisconsin, died in 2008, Easter Sunday, of complications of untreated juvenile onset diabetes. According to the case records, Kara had been showing symptoms of exhaustion and dehydration for more than a week, but her parents, Dale and Leonie Newman, refused to take her to a pediatrician and decided to respond to her illness with prayer, not medicine. Sarah Nash, of course, is the co-founder of the White Light Express and creator of the Cosmic Triage. Sarah, I want to get your reaction to this. We both know that prayer is important, but medicine's important too. Just your reaction to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I was looking at a website recently just about that because, of course, my life is all about prayer. But prayer is just a conversation between us and God. I mean, essentially, God helps those who help themselves. It always reminds me of the woman who says, God, I want to win the lottery. And she gets on her knees every night. And then finally, God appears and says, you got to buy a ticket.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the issue of prayer is not prayer. The issue of prayer is God. And in a world of prayer, basically, we're all equal in the sense that each of us is just a unique person with a unique perspective on the world and a member of a class of one.
See, I'm not going to take prayer away from this family in Wisconsin, but I think what they should have done, what I would have done as a parent, I would have sought immediate medical attention, trying to get the best attention for my child, and prayed like crazy while that was going on.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, like I said, God helps those who help themselves, and I mean, there's no cure for stupid.
No, not at all. Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah's website, of course, whitelightexpress.org. Part of our Twitter feed at coasttocoastam.com. The herbal stimulant Khat, K-H-A-T, is to be banned by the UK government against the advice of its own advisory council on the misuse of drugs. I'm mentioning this story because a lot of nations, of course, including the United States and Canada, have already banned this supplement. It is treated as a Class C drug, like in anabolic steroid or a ketamine. The Khat, K-H-A-T, has been known to cause all kinds of problems, a serious risk, they say. But according to, again, the advisory council, they're saying, no, there's nothing wrong with it, but it is going to be banned by the government in the United Kingdom. You know, it costs almost twice as much to live in New York City as it does in Marshall County, Mississippi, according to figures just published by the Economic Policy Institute. The average cost of modest living for an American family of four in the United States can be found in Newaygo County, Michigan, where $63,000 covers food, transportation, housing, child care, health care, and taxes, but no extras such as vacations, eating out, or savings. In New York, the same lifestyle costs $93,500, and in Mississippi, it can be had for $48,000. Let's get the reaction to this from Mish Shedlock, the registered investment advisor. Mish, on this Independence Day, not a lot of people are financially independent, are they?
No, not a lot of people. You know, maybe 10% are, actually a couple of percent are really well off. Another 10% are okay. Another 15% are marginal, and everyone else is living day to day. That's essentially what it boils down to. Yet, you know, I have to say, you know, speaking of the cost of living, which is what the focus of this seems to be, I go into the grocery store, and actually I see that food prices have stabilized. But I also see that weather conditions are actually reasonable for growing corn and soybeans and wheat and oats and, you know, whatever here in the Midwest. Yet I look at the price of oil, George, and it's $101 a barrel. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, okay, what's next in Egypt? What's next in the Mideast? And how does that translate into the price of gas and the price of heating? And we look at the price of education, and we look at all of these other things. So we can weigh the CPI, various measures, various ways, but it's all going to come down to energy, and it's going to come down to jobs. And we look at the government trying to promote jobs. All I see, George, is increased speculation in the financial markets, in commodities, in agricultural goods. So where are we going? We got a jobs report out tomorrow. Maybe we should check back in then and see what's happening.
We'll be here, Mish. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your Independence Day weekend. Okay, ladies, do you want to know the shoes that men hate when you wear them the most? Might as well let you know, according to a poll, it's those wedge shoes that they hate, according to this poll. Just thought you'd want to know. Okay, the hot dog eating contest, the 2013 Nathan's hot dog eating contest winner in the women's division, okay, goes to Sonia Thomas of Alexandria, Virginia. She ate, get this, in 10 minutes, 36 3/4 hot dogs. I don't know why she couldn't finish the last one. Go figure. Last year, she put away 45 hot dogs and buns, and she wanted to shoot for 50 hot dogs this year. 50. I can barely eat 2 at a sitting. Unbelievable. Anyway, throughout the night, we're going to be having special Independence Day programming for you here on Coast to Coast AM. We'll be live again on Friday night. In just a moment, Howard Bloom joins us. We're going to talk about the unrest in Egypt and what it means to you here in North America, in the United States, in Canada. And welcome back to Coast, and I hope you enjoy the start of your Independence Day weekend. Weather in the St. Louis area has been absolutely superb. And some areas, of course, getting pelted with storms and rain, but I hope you enjoyed yourself, and you do for the rest of the week, even though tonight feels like Sunday to so many people. Howard Bloom with us tonight. We're going to talk about the situation in Egypt and why it affects you. And let me tell you something. Mohammed Morsi was elected after they overthrew Mubarak and got rid of him, right? They didn't like him, so they vote for Morsi. He's the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they figure, hey, this is all great for us. Life is good. And in a short time, they got ticked off at him, too, demonstrating the army decided enough is enough. We want this guy out. It's a different way of politics in the Middle East, okay? They vote for someone, and normally they don't do that. And, you know, within a year or two, they don't like the guy's policy, and they protest, and the army throws the guy out. Could that happen here? There's only one person out there I know who can answer some of these questions. And it's Howard Bloom. So we go live to New York. Howard, how are you? Happy Independence Day.
George, hi. Happy Firecracker Day.
You sure? Absolutely.
This has been quite a ride in Egypt this week. It's been absolutely astonishing. But it's a little bit different than it may appear. It isn't just that the people became unhappy with Morsi for minor policy things. And from the point of view of an Egyptian and from the point of view of many of us watching, Morsi started very badly. He hijacked the constitutional process. He wrote the Constitution in large part to fit himself, and he began to hijack the state. He began to take it over on behalf of a theocracy. The Muslim Brotherhood, his group, they're called moderate Islamists, but they are in favor of a state that is run according to Sharia, in which people who are not Muslims are second-class citizens, and in which the top religious figures have a chokehold on the state. And the people who took to the streets back in 2011 and got rid of Mubarak did not feel that that's what they had taken to the streets for, not at all. They felt that, in the words of some bloggers, that they took to the street in order to have freedom. They feel that they are good Muslims. They don't want to be told what it takes to be a Muslim by a bunch of religious leaders who have a very narrow view of what being a Muslim is really all about. So this was very much a demonstration for what you and I would regard as freedom. And it was, the BBC calls it, and believe it or not, these figures sound a little strange for the BBC, but they call this the biggest political event in world history.
Well, it's one of the big ones, and you look at Syria where he's fighting and killing and, murdering his own people. That's another one, Howard, that should have just left. But let me ask you this question, because as a politician, Morsi made all these promises, and then as soon as he got in, as you just mentioned, he didn't do any of them. He lied to the people.
Tried to grab all the marbles.
He lied to the people. Look, it happens here in America, too, where a politician makes all these pre-campaign promises, gets elected, and then look at all the strange things that happen once that person's in office. So the $64,000 question to you, Mr. Bloom, is, can that kind of an uprising happen here?
In a way, it certainly can. Remember, before this happened, something that wasn't publicized in the United States was at a youth group called Tamarod, which started only in April, gathered 22 million signatures. That's a quarter of the population of Egypt, 22 million. According to some bloggers, and it's been quoted widely in the press, 33 million people took to the streets. 33 million is 40% of the population of Egypt. Do we have any similar reason to be dissatisfied? Well, you know me. I'm a Democrat. I'm a very faithful Democrat. I've been very, very faithful and loyal to Barack Obama. I've defended him against all kinds of strange charges from my friends on the right. And yet, within the last month, I've become utterly disgusted with him. Why? Because he made certain campaign promises. He promised us honesty. He promised us transparency. Meanwhile, Bradley Manning released 630,000 secret documents. Is that an indictment of Bradley Manning, or is that an indictment of us for keeping 630,000 documents in the last 2 years secret from the American public?
That's
Then
right.
came the Edward Snowden incident, and it turned out that not only are we keeping vital facts secret from the American public, we're also spying on the American public and on the public worldwide. Now, there are certain justifications for this, but in the end, there's a Constitution, and the Constitution is based on the idea that a democracy can only exist when you have an informed populace, informed individual citizens. Every third day, an article comes out in the New York Times that quotes extensively from the documents that were released by Bradley Manning. And the quotes from those documents give vital insights that have nothing to do with whether you and I are going to be blown up by a terrorist.
I agree. Well, see, Howard, here's my take. I think what the president should have done, and this is the public relations mistake he has made that could cost, a 2016 Democrat the presidential seat. And that is, he should have said, folks, let me tell you about terrorism. You saw what happened on 9/11. You know it's out there. You know there are some people out there that hate our guts. And this is what we're going to do about it. We're going to monitor internet chatter worldwide. We're going to monitor text messaging. We're going to monitor some phone calls. And we may end up monitoring you because it's all inclusive. But we're not interested in you. We're interested in terror. We're interested in these people who want to kill you. And that's the plan. What would have happened had he come out and said that from the get-go?
Well, that's called transparency. That's called honesty. That's what we were promised in the election campaigns that Barack Obama ran, campaigns I believed in and got very excited by. And that would have changed things dramatically. But only in the last 2 weeks, the lies, and I hate to call them that, but that's what they are, have continued.
They are.
When Obama decided to send weapons to Syria. Now, remember, a month and a half ago, he had gotten evidence that he considered ambivalent about chemical weapons use in Syria. And he had drawn a bright red line, and all of a sudden he said it had turned to fuzzy pink because the evidence wasn't sufficient. But when he said he was going to send small weapons or weapons to Syria in the last 2 weeks, he said he was going to do it because of the chemical weapons. Had the evidence changed? There's no indication anywhere that the evidence had changed at all. Why was he really doing this? Because the Syrian rebels, the so-called Syrian rebels, had lost a major city. They lost the city of Qusayr. That left them only with 2 other cities, Homs, where they're under fire right now, and Aleppo. Now, if he had told us the position of the Syrian rebels is seriously weakened and we need to do something to shore them up, that would have been transparency. That would have been honesty. Mm-hmm. Now, in the last 2 days, in issuing statements about what's happened in Egypt, he has said, our policy all along has been to support democracy. Several major pieces have appeared, not in the right-wing publications, but from Reuters and AP, that have done a point-by-point rundown of the things that were said by Hillary Clinton, by Barack Obama, about our position toward Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood. And the opposite is true. We have not supported democracy. Hillary Clinton said, we will support you no matter who you are in Egypt and no matter what you do. This was not a pro-democracy policy. Again, if he had been honest in the last 2 days, it would have been a whole different ballgame. But if you remove our right to know, if you remove our right to have vital information, if you turn us from an informed populace to an uninformed populace, you undermine the very root of what it is to be to have a democracy, and that's when and why you might someday see a similar kind of demonstration in the streets of America.
I mean, we saw what happened during the Vietnam War. I did not agree with it. I was in college for most of those years, but I was always concerned about why we were attacking our troops and not the issue itself, okay? The troops had no say-so. They were there. Some
right.
got drafted. They were doing what I'm sure they did not want to do. Yet we attacked them. Howard, we're going to take this break, come back, talk more with you about all of this, and I want to take some phone calls, too, with our coast-to-coast listeners who I am sure have some views about this. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back with Howard Bloom. We'll take your phone calls this half hour as well as we talk about the unrest in the Middle East, in Egypt specifically, and what that means to us here at home. I do think, Howard, eventually people in the United States, people all over the region, are going to say enough is enough. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of getting lied to. And I think we're going to start seeing some civil unrest, aren't you?
Well, you saw me a month ago when I really got fed up. It took me something like a year and a half, or actually almost 3 years, to make up my mind about the Bradley Manning thing. You know, I'm vitally concerned with American security because I'm very aware of the international dangers and the dangers of terrorism. But the fact is, something deeply disturbed me about the treatment of Bradley Manning. And finally, I made my mind up 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago and realized that what Bradley Manning was doing was vital to America, that we need whistleblowers from time to time, that we were told by the Nuremberg trials that sometimes it is more important to stand up for what you believe is right than what you are told to do, what you are ordered to do. Bradley Manning did that. Edward Snowden did that. I went to White House Gov to look for a petition to free Bradley Manning, which I admit is a bit extreme, but nonetheless, I was going to sign it. There was none there. I wrote one, and that petition was up for the last month. So, and there are others getting fed up. Within the last few days, there's a group that has attempted to organize July 4th demonstrations. Now, the July 4th demonstrations turned out to be minor, not major, here in the United States. but they started from nothing. And if they're given time to organize, and if they do it as thoroughly and methodically as Tamarud, the youth group, did in Egypt, they could get somewhere, because you're fed up, I'm fed up, we have very different political points of view on many things, and yet, look, this honesty, transparency, freedom of information, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, these are the values of America, whether you're on the right, whether you're on the left, no matter where you stand. And they're being violated right now, right on up to the White House.
Let's take a few calls here. Joe in Rochester, New York, east of the Rockies. Welcome to Coast, Joseph. Go ahead.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hi.
I have a question about the situation in Egypt. Does this look potentially dangerous going forward, where so many people protested to get Morsi out after electing him? What happens if the next person that's elected democratically, a portion of the people don't like him, they feel that they should go right to the streets, and a significant portion don't want to? And instead of waiting for the ballot box, I think it might be dangerous that they're doing it this way. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. It takes a combination of structure and a certain degree of flexibility to run any kind of government. And if you rip the structure apart, if you rip apart the civic habits that make a society work, you can rip that society apart. I mean, there were two major revolutions back between 1776 and 1800. One of them was the American Revolution. The other one was the French Revolution. The American revolutionaries concentrated on establishing a structure for a government. That's what the Federalist Papers and the Constitution were all about. The French focused on taking to the streets. And the French Revolution turned out horribly. 40,000 people were killed by the guillotine alone. So, yes, you need that kind of structure. You need that kind of discipline. And when Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood right now, who are being rounded up, who are being accused of insulting the judiciary. I mean, I can't think of a greater excuse for tyranny than being able to accuse people of insulting the judiciary and sending them to jail on that basis. The Muslim Brotherhood, for whom I have no sympathy whatsoever, have said something very valid, and that is we had validity because we were elected. Wait until the next election. And you're right about that, Joe. That makes a great deal of sense.
Well, and as we know in politics, Howard, if 50% love you, 50% hate you, no matter who's in office at any given time. Is that what they're going to do in Egypt? And will they do that in other nations where the 50% who just aren't happy, will never be happy, will just always protest?
It also takes time to accomplish anything. One of the dissatisfactions, a major dissatisfaction, with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, again, was that it was producing a theocracy and it was going to choke the lifestyle freedoms of people in Egypt. But another major complaint was that the economy wasn't getting any better and that the amount of electricity per day, which was erratic, was not getting any better. Well, it takes time to mend an economy. From 2007 and 2008, when we started our major Great Recession, it took us a couple of years to turn things around. And
we haven't even
turned around.
Exactly. We're still limping, and so that's a problem. But we're seeing constitutional rights eroded away here.
Right, we are. And again, that's why we really do have to wake up to the fact that our rights are being eroded dramatically. Again, when there are 4 million people who have top secret or who have secret security clearance, that makes them a secrecy elite. That gives them a different lifestyle and different privileges than you and I have. And when you separate out a group with different privileges, eventually it has contempt for the other groups, the normal citizens in the world around it. I find this with some of my military friends. Some of them, they're way up at the lieutenant colonel level. And they're some of the finest people you ever meet in your life. They have a greater sense of the civic virtues that make a democracy possible than any other humans I've ever met in my life. But for quite a while now, for the last few years, they've been cut off from simple things like YouTube and Facebook. They've been cut off because the military is afraid, for good reason, that if it opens up to YouTube and Facebook, it's going to open a big hole through which the hackers, especially hackers from places like China, can jump in. The fact is, that means that my friends are no longer living the kind of life you and I are living because they don't have access to the kind of daily media soup in which we swim. And it makes them different, and they're no longer able to feel things in quite the way you and I are. And that's when you develop aristocracies that are utterly removed from the normal citizenry. And those kinds of aristocracies, we had a revolution against those aristocracies. It's called the American Revolution because they're deadly to freedom.
Let's go to Cincinnati, Ohio. First-time caller. Harry's with us. Hey, Harry, go ahead.
Oh, yes. And I want to thank you for taking my call. And I'm a long-time listener from Art Bell, right on up to you, George, and you're a wonderful host. I think you're just a wonderful guy. And I just want to say that, yes, our freedoms are being eroded and we're being lied to. Like Benghazi, when that first started to erupt, I knew that there was a cover-up going on. From the very first of it, it just smelled bad to me, and I want to know what you thought about that.
Well, I initially, because I'm a big supporter of Obama, and because Obama has been under some really terrible assaults that had almost nothing to do with the truth. It's been said that he is really an underground Marxist, and he's trying to make America into a socialist totalitarian state, and at the same time, the same people say that he's a closet Muslim. These are a little bit crazy. So initially, I defended him on Benghazi. But the fact is, you're absolutely right. This was not about a film made in the United States that offended Muslims. And there's an outrage that you and I have not been paying attention to. The man who made the film that was offensive in the Islamic world, a world that is very easily offended by things we don't think you should be offended about. That man, to the best of my knowledge, is in jail and has been in jail for quite a bit of time. That is not freedom of speech. You do not turn on your own citizens in order to satisfy the citizens of a foreign country who do not understand freedom of expression.
Next up, thank you, Harry. Appreciate your call. Rosemary is in Oakland, California. Hey, Rosemary, welcome to Coast to Coast. Happy Independence Day and weekend.
Thank you, and the same to you. I had a question about Edward Snowden.
Yep, I'm ready. I've been studying him at length.
Oh, wonderful. I've read that they confiscated his passport.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, is that legal to do? I believe I've never heard of them doing that.
They do have the right. Howard, go ahead, but they do have the right to do that.
For me to know if that is legal, that's one thing I have not looked into. Edward Snowden says it is not. It turns him into a man without a country. However, the pressure we've been putting on other countries to turn this man over to us is outrageous. This is a guy who really did heroic things in order to reveal information to you and me that you and I should have known all along. There is no way in heaven or hell that our government has a right to spy on us universally. That has been recognized for a long, long time through, for example, the difference between the CIA, which does external things, and the FBI, which does internal things. We should have been allowed to know, just as George said, we should have been told up front that these are some of the things that we feel it's necessary to do, because as members of a democratic society, it's up to us to be able to debate those things and say, no, it's not your right. That's our right.
And you know what, Howard? I wouldn't be half as upset if we were told up front. You know, I'm not sending out terroristic things, so I could care less. But if they could catch a terrorist, hey, all for it, go for it. But if we were told up front and we knew they were doing this, I'd have a different perspective.
Well, secrecy is needed when you're doing something like trying to track down bin Laden. So you don't want bin Laden to know your every move. But there are a relatively small number of those tactical and strategic things that the enemy has to be kept from the enemy. And usually when it comes to things like our spying on just about everybody on the planet, including you and me, those are things the enemy knows long before we do. And at a certain point, the secrecy is no longer secrecy for national security. It's secrecy to keep our citizens, our own citizens, in the dark, and that is anti-democratic.
Howard, you're very sensitive, of course, to Israel. And I want to get your views on the Egyptian situation as far as Israel's concerned. Morsi was no fan of Israel.
Well, I've been, I'm an overt Zionist, atheist, and Jew, and I've become extremely popular on Saudi and Iranian television because, of all things, they're more interested in hearing the points of view of
sure.
atheist, Zionist, Jew than anybody in the United States is.
You've got them all.
But the fact is that the animosity in the streets of Cairo and of the other Egyptian cities, because this has been all over Egypt and city after city, has not primarily been against Israel. It's been against the United States.
That's right.
Pictures of our own ambassador, her name is Patterson, have appeared all over the place. Pictures of Obama in negative ways have appeared all over the place. These have been widely regarded in Egypt by the people in them as anti-American demonstrations. And they have said that Morsi is a pawn of the United States. Now,
I don't think he is. Hey, Howard, hold on for 1 second. I've got a breaking story in California, northwest of Los Angeles. There's an area called Simi Valley. Eric Leonard, our reporter for our affiliate KFI, is with us. They had a fireworks explosion, apparently. Eric, can you give us an update on just what has happened out there?
We're still, George, waiting for an update from the Ventura County Fire Authorities to get an official account of what happened. But based on what witnesses at the scene have told me, the fireworks show here, of course, for July 4th, began as usual. This is a large park at the southwest end of the town of Simi Valley. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were crowded in to see it. At some point, a few minutes after the show began, there was a large explosion, or a larger explosion, at the base of the fireworks launching area that was unusual, and within a moment of that, there was a much bigger explosion, and then the skyrockets that usually go several hundred feet into the air and explode began launching directly above the ground and into the crowd, and then were exploding right where people were sitting. We know that 8 or 9 ambulances were sent to the scene. Some of them have sped away with patients, taken them to hospitals, and then the ambulances have returned. So it's hard to get a definite count on the number of injured, but it looks like it's going to be in the area of 1 dozen. The severity of their injuries also unclear at this point. One member of the pyrotechnic crew that was putting on the presentation here was also hurt, but it sounds like his injury is among the least serious.
And so it would seem that the many spectators have probably been injured as well then, Eric, not just the crew members.
Right. It sounds like the bulk of the injured were, in fact, the people here to watch the show, especially the people sitting closest to the area where the fireworks were being launched, because when those rocket launchers tipped over and began firing towards the crowd, obviously whoever is closest is going to bear the brunt of it. And the fireworks explosives themselves are not particularly what you would consider high explosives, but any kind of explosion going off close to you is highly, highly dangerous and hot. There's the potential of burns. We know from, again, eyewitness accounts that some of those injured were holding their eyes as if debris or something had hurt them there. But again, without an official account of the injured from the fire department, which we're waiting on right now, it's hard to give you too many specifics other than the anecdotal stories of the people who were in the crowd to enjoy the show, who then, of course, panicked like anybody would and tried to get away.
Okay, Eric, thank you so much. And those of you in the greater Los Angeles area, please just keep your radios tuned to AM 640. They will be giving you updates throughout the evening about this tragedy that has happened in the Simi Valley area of California, a beautiful rural area. Everybody out there trying to have a grand time with the fireworks out there, and this tragedy has occurred. You know, Howard, fireworks, they're like bombs, and, in the St. Louis area, they put on an annual fireworks display, and sometimes they just go off, just like an explosion. Very dangerous situation.
And they're very similar to artillery. At a ZZ Top concert back in the 1970s, a 4th of July concert, the fireworks were enormous. And I made the mistake, although it was an adventure, of going out into the area from which they were launched, right in the middle of the fireworks. And it is like being in the middle of World War I.
It sure is. Well, let's take, if we have time, one more quick question for you. Olivia in Washington, D.C. Go ahead, Olivia. I've got about 40 seconds.
Wow. I'd like to just give Mr. Bloom accolades on the Lucifer Principle. That's one of the best books I've ever read. And I'd just like to quickly ask him, does he think that the situation with the people in Egypt may be beyond their control, as if maybe HARP or maybe some type of underground Tesla-like situation where the people are being incited to violence?
Okay,
well, it is beyond
mind
their
control
already, because the new government has done a crackdown on the Mohammed Brotherhood. In a democracy, you do not do a crackdown. You have political parties, and when you change from one to the other, you don't put all the members of one party, or at least all the leaders of one party, in jail, and that's what's happening right now. Plus, Tamarud itself, the youth movement, gathered the 22 million signatures, and it was very, very instrumental in producing these enormous demonstrations. To accomplish what they accomplished, roughly 20 pop songs alone being written about what Tamarud was doing, takes resources. And it is difficult to determine where the resources for Tamarud came from. Some suspicions are the resources may have come from the military. You know that once paranoia and conspiracy theories take hold, they can be wildly inaccurate. Still, it is a good question. Where did the funding come from?
Howard, thank you, my friend. Enjoy the rest of the Independence Day weekend. Howard Bloom, his website, of course, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Up next this Independence Day weekend, disinformation. Former spy chief reveals secret strategies for undermining freedom, attacking religion, and promoting terrorism. Independence Night, very special night. We're going to talk about disinformation and how it affects you. This is a major story, and we'll be back with the authors of the book in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, so after you're all done now, you've had your friends, your family, maybe you've been by yourself, maybe you had to work today, sit back and relax. Here's one of the programs that you are going to remember forever. It's called Disinformation. First of all, he's back. David Kopilian, our special guest. David was on with me just a few years ago, and also we're going to be joined by Ronald Rishlock, and I'm going to tell you about both of them in a second here, but this is a very important story about the consequences of disinformation campaigns. Now, David is a veteran journalist, managing editor of the online news giant WorldNet Daily, WND it's called now, as its monthly magazine, also whistleblower in a career spanning 3 decades. He had a book out, How Evil Works. We talked with him about that, and he's part of the co-author of Disinformation. Ronald Rishlock, by the way, has been a professor of law at the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss, for a number of years, teaching constitutional law, criminal law, and, of course, on terrorism and the law. And here they both are on Coast to Coast. First of all, David, welcome back. Good to have you.
Thanks, George. It's great to be back.
I'm looking forward to this. And, Ronald, welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here.
And this is going to be free flowing. So even though I may address one or two of you in the beginning, both of you feel free to jump in. And let's just discuss this. But just to start with you, David, how have you been?
I've been very well. And since you invited us to jump in, I want to dive in, if I may, and just set one thing straight, because it brings out one of the most fascinating things about this book is that I am actually not the co-author. I'm the editor of the book. Ron Rishlock is a co-author, but the big star, the former communist spy chief that defected to the U.S. and spilled his guts in this book, is not here. And normally, I'm an author, Ron is an author. When you write a book, the author is the number one person that is out there promoting the book. It's part of what you do as an author. So why is this author not on this huge and very important radio show? And it is because he cannot, because he still, after 35 years after defecting, because he's 84 years old now, he has active assassination threats against him, and he lives under a CIA protective identity. In the United States, he's a proud American citizen and has been a huge asset for the U.S. intelligence services since he had essentially a crisis of conscience and came out of the dark side and came to the U.S. He's the highest-ranking intelligence defector ever from the Cold War out of the Soviet bloc. But even today, you say, oh, well, the Cold War, that was a long time ago. Still, his life is in danger. There are intact death threats and multi-million-dollar rewards for his life and so forth. So he simply has to live in a secret, undisclosed location, as we like to say, and that's why he can't be here.
Why did he jump ship so many years ago, Dave? It sounds a little like Edward Snowden, except he was in the military.
Well, you got to remember that he was the right-hand man to the dictator for life, Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. He was the head of foreign intelligence there. He was a top Soviet bloc spy master. But the thing about we're talking about Ion Mihai Pacepa, who's a two-star general.
Okay.
He had something called a conscience. He basically, even though he was swept up into the Securitate, which is the secret police in Romania, he was basically drafted into it out of a high school, out of college, and he didn't have much choice about that. But he lived in that world, and he totally admits he was swept up in it and involved in many bad things for many years, but he had something in him that was beyond all the conditioning and the intense pressure of the communist machine that swept up so many millions of people. And he had a lot of conflict about it for a long time before he finally, in 1978, stepped into the U.S. Embassy in West Germany and said, I am a two-star general and a top, commie spy chief, and I want to defect to America. Long before that, he wanted to, and he had to pick his time because it's very dangerous. So basically, he wasn't bad to the core. He was a good man inside, and he was caught up in the system. And eventually, he found the time and the courage to make the jump.
Well, let's bring in the Professor Rislock. Rhonda, how did you guys all find this Lieutenant General?
Well, it really was a sort of long process for me, anyway. He is an occasional commentator on political matters in the United States. He writes articles. Mm-hmm. And by the way, while he's not with us tonight, he's assured me he is listening tonight, so he's in the audience tonight,
wherever he may be. Right?
Yeah, but he wrote an article in 2007 that was of interest to some of my research. I spent essentially 2 years. What he said in that article was that the Catholic Pope during World War II, Pope Pius XII, the one who is unfortunately sometimes known as Hitler's Pope, he said, right. That's all a myth. That was a matter of disinformation that we created in the Soviet bloc. And I had done a lot of writing in that area and written a couple books, and it was the first time that story had broken. And I spent 2 years researching it. And after 2 years, I came to the conclusion this made everything make sense. Things that had not previously made sense when you put that component in. I wrote a chapter in a book, and I sent that chapter off to a publisher who published his commentary and said, can you get this to Pacepa? And they got it to Pacepa, and he got in touch with me, and we've been in very regular contact ever since.
And, of course, the name of the book, Disinformation, with the subheading, Former Spy Chief Revealing Secret Strategies for Undermining Freedom, Attacking Religion, and Promoting Terrorism. This disinformation campaign, was this primarily done by the Soviets, or was this also something that we've done here in the United States, Ron?
Well, disinformation is really from the Soviet Union and from Russian history is in essence something they cultivated as a science. It developed originally within Russia, within the Soviet Union. He was involved in misleading America, misleading the West. We see it today. We see it within the United States. We see it from outside of the United States. So it's a science, if you will. It's a technique, but it's very evident still today.
How did he defect to the United States? How did he get away?
Well, as David said, he went into the American embassy, And this was a time. There's really a fascinating story here. It had been his job to persuade the West that Ceausescu, the leader of Romania, was the modern communist, the good communist, the communist leader the West could do business with. And he was very persuasive, very good at this. And he gives the account of where he's standing at the White House alongside Jimmy Carter and Ceausescu. And Jimmy Carter is talking about what a great man Ceausescu is and how this is the new face of communism in the new world. And Pachepa is looking at this going, I can't believe I fooled the leader of the United States so fully and so completely. He knew somehow at that point he knew that he had done something really kind of very wrong that he wanted to correct. He eventually found the right moment, left a brief note. He had to leave his family behind. Has a daughter he left behind, but went into the American embassy, and he was immediately put on a plane and brought over to Washington, D.C., where he spent about 3 years debriefing American intelligence officers.
No, go ahead, Dave.
If I can just interject, George.
Yeah, absolutely.
He did such a good job in pulling off the disinformation campaign that it somewhat backfired on him, because once he defected here and he was so eager to spill his guts and tell all the secrets of what was really going on, because communist Romania was in many ways worse than Moscow and Russia was. It was a very dark place. He did such a good job that Carter didn't believe him. He in other words, he had done too good a job, and Carter had too much ego, I guess, invested in believing that Ceausescu was his friend. Carter was in some ways like our current president, who believes that his charisma and wonderful personality will win over dictators, and so it wasn't really until Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 that Reagan was of a different mind and believed Pachepa, and his intelligence community said, "Oh wow, we have a really important asset to our intelligence services that can show us the way around this mysterious world of the Soviet intelligence apparatus."
And as we're going to get into tonight, the disinformation covered all kinds of subjects. Were we doing the same thing, David, or Ron?
I don't think we did. We had it to the level of the science. Of course, there's always been propaganda, but there's a difference with disinformation and with propaganda. If a message comes from an enemy, go back to Vietnam War, and if the Soviet Union talked about horrible things that our soldiers were doing, on the battlefield, we'd discount it because, well, that's the Soviet Union saying it. The same story comes out of the New York Times, comes out of our soldiers, comes from our leaders in Washington. Now we tend to trust it, and that's what disinformation is about. It's your fingerprints are wiped off of it. It seems to come from an impeccable source, a source you would trust, and I don't think the United States ever developed it to the level that it did exist and continues to exist in Russia, the Soviet Union.
Right. We were more the vector, the transmitter of the Soviet-born disinformation. But the Western media that tend to be, liberal left and more sympathetic toward those types of worldview, they were very easy to implant the information. So it's sort of a double lie. The information is a lie, but like Ron said, you've wiped your fingerprints off it and you've implanted it into what appears to be a credible source. It's kind of like money laundering. And so you launder the information and it comes out and it's more credible. They say consider the source when you're talking about information. Right. So if you can make the source appear to be, let's say, the New York Times, a Western news organization, fair and balanced, professional, a journalistic inquiry, it carries a lot more weight than if it's just a press release from Pravda or Izvestia.
How were the techniques used for disinformation? I mean, what are some of the things they were able to accomplish? What were the tools that they used?
Well, among the tools, it's recruiting of writers, of journalists, funding speakers, funding magazines, One of the big cases we talk about in the book involves funding a play and then reviews of the play.
You're kidding? A play? Really?
Yeah, really, a play. And a play, in a way, is a beautiful thing because when it's attacked and you show that it's factually incorrect, you can say, well, there had to be artistic license. So of course, so you deflect the criticism in that manner.
So there really were no boundaries for what they wanted to go after and do.
Yeah, and the book outlines many of these absolutely fascinating disinformation campaigns that I'm sure we'll get into, and some of which are very, still very influential today. But one that has gone into with the greatest depth is the one that had to do with Pius. And the value of reading through that is it shows you how fantastically complicated and serpentine and complex they got. It wasn't just, here's a one-shot deal, let's run it up the flagpole, see if it works. These were multi-year, complicated things that they did. One of the metaphors that the book uses is that disinformation happens like a water drip, the way water will drip and can cut actually into stone, but it takes a long time. It's not just like an operation where, bang, it's done. It's something that is affecting people's attitudes, affecting their beliefs over a period of time. And the Russians seemed, even going back before the Communist Revolution, back to the Tsars, to have a certain sort of cultural love of lying and misleading in a very, very complicated, strange way. It's really a different world.
It is amazing how they did that. Now, and the technique itself for disinformation, was there one individual responsible for developing this beyond the lieutenant general who was one of its implementers? Who's the genius behind all this?
Well, there's a long history, and in the book we trace back really some very old origins of disinformation in Russia prior to Soviet time. But what really took it to an international level was Andropov when he became leader of the KGB and then later leader of the Soviet Union itself. He was the one who realized that there were applications beyond what had taken place before. If you want one example, for instance, very common if you look at particularly Soviet but also Russian history, when a new leader comes along, the old leader gets discredited, gets blamed for things. So Khrushchev really launched a disinformation campaign about Stalin, and talked about how bad he was, and secretly, wink, wink, released information that came back to criticize Stalin. So you blame everything on the prior leader. And Andropov realized we don't just have to do this within our nation. We can take this and launch attacks against leaders of the foreign nations, and we can do disinformation either way. You also can build people up. Ceausescu was built up with disinformation. Western leaders were discredited.
Okay, so this has been a campaign then that has been going on for a long time. Is it still happening today, David?
Yes, it is. And in fact, here's the funny thing: where the main organization we're talking about, the Soviet intelligence organization, is the KGB. And people think, oh, KGB, that's that organization that used to be in the Soviet Union, but the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union, disintegrated, and there's no more KGB. Now it's the FSB. Oh, that's really interesting. Are we stupid? This is like Acorn. Acorn gets discredited, okay, then they go and change their name, and they're all meeting in the same building, doing the same things, exactly, but they changed their name.
With
Acorn
the same people.
Gone now.
Yeah.
Well, the FSB, by all accounts, does the same sorts of things in the same way as the KGB, and of course Vladimir Putin, who is the current top dog in Russia, is a KGB chief, and everybody who knows this subject says, look, basically, once you're a KGB man, that's how you think. We concurrent with the release of the book, we put out a a 2-hour feature-length film documentary that shot up to the #1 film documentary in the country on Amazon, also called Disinformation. And among the guests there is the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and who teaches in New York now. And she says, yes, it's all the same. In many ways, it's worse now than it was during the heyday of the Soviet Union and Khrushchev and Andropov and so forth, because there's more of a cover now. We think, well, like I say, the Berlin Wall came down, and now they're our friends, and George W. Bush looked into Putin's eye and said, I see this man's soul, and I can trust him, and everything's just great now, except that they tend to side with all of our enemies. Have you noticed that?
Oh, absolutely. David, hold on for a second. We're going to hit this break. I'll be back with both of you as we talk about disinformation. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, this Friday, ufologist Stanton Friedman will be my guest on our television show Beyond Belief, and you can watch this program 10 days free, so take advantage of it. Simply go to coasttocoastam.com. You can click hosts and then click the TV button, and there it is. Or go to GaiamTV.com/George, GAIAM, TV.com/George. Fill out the information, and again, you can look at that for free. Stanton Friedman, an incredible guest as we talk about UFOs. We're going to be back in a moment, and we're going to talk more about disinformation right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. We're with one of the managing editors of WND, David Kapulyan, as we're talking about disinformation with Professor Ronald Rislock, of course. Ronald, tell me a little bit more about the Lieutenant General, if you can, his background, and subsequently, once he came here, I've always been curious, how do they live? How do they exist? I mean, does the government provide them, or what happens there?
Well, George, I wish I could tell you more about that. Because he lives with a $2 million bounty on his head, there were at least at one point some assassination squads in the United States looking for him, and in all likelihood there still are some individuals at least still doing that. I don't know many details about his life.
Okay. All right. Now, as you mentioned, he's still alive. He's listening to the program right now. How long was this disinformation campaign as far as he was concerned? How long did he last?
There were disinformation campaigns over many different topics, and his career was essentially running various disinformation campaigns. He was involved in cultivating anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East to create a new kind of really what is developed into modern terrorism. He attacked Western values by attacking church leaders. He was involved, of course, in building up Ceausescu. But there are a number of disinformation campaigns like that we talk about in the book.
What was the original goal of disinformation? What did they want to accomplish?
Well, disinformation is really a way to win a war. It is if you can convince your opponents to lay down their weapons, to walk off the battlefield, if you can convince neutrals to become active agents in your behalf, and really for the success of communism, there's sort of an important principle here to understand. In 1948, communism almost took over in Italy, but it was defeated. Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, ended up writing a lot about that and what happened and why communism failed in Italy. And part of it was the value, the Christian ethic, the Judeo-Christian ethic that was deeply embedded in the society. And he said in order for communism ultimately to succeed, you have to attack the society. You have to undermine religion. So that was an important part of it as well.
Okay, so basically, and I don't have a problem with disinformation if it helps your particular country in any type of action. I'm convinced the United States is doing it and probably has been doing it for maybe just as long, don't you?
Hey, George?
Yeah, David.
Could I just jump in and address that a little bit?
Sure.
Because Yes, the U.S. has never been lily white. We've had, but I want to explain just the difference. There's a difference between disinformation and misinformation and propaganda and lies and deception. Let me just. I mentioned before I compared it with money laundering. If I can just let me expand that a tiny bit to just paint a picture for your listeners of how this works. If you just think, because it's such a great analogy, if you think about what money laundering is, there's basically three parts. There's placement. You take this tainted money, this dirty money, okay, and you introduce it into a respected financial institution. And then it's something called layering, where this, respectable institution does a series of transactions and things designed to camouflage the original source. And then the third part is integration, where the once dirty money is now magically clean. And we all understand this. Okay, drug money, now it's been laundered. But information laundering, so to speak, is you have misinformation, which is just maybe intentionally wrong information, okay? It doesn't have to be inadvertent. Government misinformation can be a bunch of lies, but it's still misinformation if it's coming directly from the government. But if it is introduced into a respected journalism organization, and that media organization showcases this misinformation in a news report, camouflaging its original source, now the public receives the laundered information in the form of apparently clean, that is credible news. And that is what you call disinformation. So it's not just the lie, it's the fact that it has been implanted in this clever way. So people, it's a double lie. The information is a lie and the source is lied about. And what's one of the things that's shocking to me about this book, and I've written 2 books about evil before. This is familiar ground to me, but just getting into this in the process of working with the authors and editing the book is how shameless the Soviet bloc was. It's to lie like this and to be so proud of it. Honestly, when I try to wrap my mind around it, the only way I can come to grips with it is if I think about if I were in a Operation Valkyrie type of thing, there were many plots against Hitler. If I were Klaus von Stauffenberg or Bonhoeffer, one of these righteous people trying to do away with Hitler and to stop a terrible war and end all this carnage, you would be lying your head off and deceiving all the time, because war is deception, Sun Tzu said, and you're at war. You're behind enemy lines. And in that context, you can understand strategically you have to lie all the time, but that has a righteous value. The Soviet Union was not righteous. It was a system that was based on a lie. Everybody was lied to and bamboozled. But it's such an open. General Pachepa writes about it. They called it a science of. Yeah. How do you call it a science? You're lying. How does that become a science? Yeah. So it really. One of the advantages they have is that the Western mind can barely even wrap its brain cells around this to understand how much malevolence there was in this.
Well, David, if I could jump in just for a moment.
Okay, go ahead, Ron.
One of the things that really amazed me when I first was working on this, General Pachepa talked about the book they had in the KGB on disinformation, how they bragged about certain projects being tremendously successful disinformation campaigns. And it was the kind of thing that I just thought, if this is true, you would never write about. You couldn't put this in a book. And I even said that. I said, I have trouble, including this in the book because this sounds too far out for me. And he said, no, it's true. And sure enough, we found 2 or 3 other authors who'd written about it. We, in fact, found quotations and found, the original source where, indeed, the KGB in their manual bragged about these great disinformation campaigns.
I've been watching past episodes of Mad Men. It's a television series about a 1960s ad agency. And, one of the big things that they were all doing in those days, of course, trying to handle cigarette accounts. And, whatever they did brilliantly, but it was disinformation at its best. Is it something like that where basically they set up a campaign for any specific topic and they go for it, and they try to create this disinformation around it?
Well, I wrote in How Evil Works about Edward Bernays, who wrote a book called Propaganda. That's before propaganda was a bad word. That was back in the 1920s. Yeah. And he's the guy who basically, his job was to make smoking okay for women, because there was a time when in America men smoked, but it wasn't considered feminine or decent for women to smoke. Right. And so he set up a parade, a holiday parade, where he had women marching down the street, and all on cue, they broke out the cigarettes, and they had, I can't remember right now what it was. It was some kind of slogan that went with it. And that basically busted down the doors of consciousness and of that taboo against women smoking. So, yeah, in a sense, that was disinformation. It was a crass, commercial appeal for a client, okay, Philip Morris or whoever it was. But it wasn't just like, hey, women should smoke, because that's not going to go anywhere. But it was done in this event so that it seemed like something that was not related to a commercial venture, and it had a certain pizzazz to it. And he had also gotten all the media all in on it. They knew about it too. So it was quite an event that was planned, and it worked.
Now, depending on what side you're on, is disinformation, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Well, if you're lying and deceiving people, look, there's liberals, there's conservatives listening right now. Liberals think that we should have universal health care, because that should be a universal right, and conservatives think that's not a good idea. But I think both liberals, conservatives, independents, I don't know any group that thinks that lying and deceiving people is good. I don't know how you justify that unless you are in my Valkyrie scenario, where you are at war with Nazis that are burning Jews in ovens, and hey, whatever it takes to put this to an end, you do, because you're at war. Yeah. So I suppose if you think you're at war, then that's how you justify it. And look, they thought this was a science, but it's based on Marxism, and Marx and Engels, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto, they considered this to be a science. This was in the wake of Darwin. It wasn't like, this is our theory, we think it's a better way to organize society. They absolutely thought this is hard science, what they were writing there.
Well, what the science was, I think, David and Ronald, it was the science of manipulating the mind. And that is probably what they did very well, don't you think?
They did.
Let's go into some specific cases that you write about in the book, Disinformation. Let's start with, of course, former Senator John Kerry, who now is part of the administration's team. What happened to him?
Well, if you remember, in 1971, John Kerry very famously testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This was after returning from a 4-month tour of duty in Vietnam. And he sat there. There's probably 50 different versions of this on YouTube. Everybody can see it. He basically slandered American servicemen, telling these stories about American troops who daily were cutting off heads and ears, torturing people, razing villages in a manner reminiscent of Genghis Khan. I'm trying to remember some of the quotes. And the point is that all wars have atrocities. It's not what he was saying. He said literally, quote, on a day-to-day basis. He said this is routine. It's happening all the time. And this was later really this was proven to be untrue. In fact, decades later, when he was running for president, Kerry said that he was just angry, and he admitted he was way over the top in his testimony. But what we find out in the book, Disinformation, is that contemporaneous to John Kerry, poisoning the well of American consciousness about this war effort, there was a KGB disinformation campaign that was identical. The claims about Americans, cutting off body parts and a manner reminiscent of Genghis Khan, this was all coming from the KGB. So this makes a very good circumstantial case that Kerry was a useful idiot in this sense. And I want to hasten to add, the book does not say that he was intentionally cooperating with the KGB. That he was inadvertently taken in by this, but it's pretty damning to show. And there was even a name for it. It was called Operation Ares. This was a drop-off campaign. It was a KGB disinformation campaign to turn Americans against their own government during the Vietnam War. Because guess what? United States of America, most powerful military in history, and North Vietnam, guess which one is going to win in a fair fight? Okay, the U.S., regardless of what you think about the war, on the ground, the U.S. was winning that war. Even the Tet Offensive, the U.S. won that, and later on, the North Vietnamese generals were scratching their heads, saying, "How is it the American media says that we won the Tet Offensive? We lost every battle in the Tet Offensive."
Yeah.
So this was the way they could win was by poisoning the U.S. public, the news media, and eventually persuading, by all that pressure, Congress to cut and run, to pull the funding on the war effort, which eventually they did.
Well, would you call, for example, the 2003 Iraq War weapons of mass destruction also disinformation? I'm convinced, David and Ron, that President George Bush really believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I think he was lied to by his own staff.
You know, it's certainly possible that he was lied to. I think, though, if you look back, you look at the evidence, I think people were fooled one way or another. I don't think it was really what we would call disinformation, though. It was probably misinformation. It was a mistake. It was misreading the evidence. It
could have been a lie. It could have been a straight lie.
I mean, it could have been, but I mean, but I don't know if we see some fingerprints wiped off. I mean, it came from our intelligence officers, and I suppose you're saying if they would have been lying to it, but it seems that happened to intelligence agencies around the world as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's possible because at the time, and you can go back, in the age of YouTube, everything is there, not just George W. Bush, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi. They all adamantly said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. He's got, in fact, all these clips you can see in the disinformation documentary film that we've got. So if anything, the disinformation campaign at the time was basically Bush lied, people died. It wasn't that the assessment was wrong. It's that Bush was venal, that he was evil, and that he intentionally did this to help Halliburton or some cockamamie thing like that. That was basically what the left was saying at the time, and that is something that really offends General Pacheco, because he came from a background where to glorify a leader is to glorify the country, and to attack the leader is to attack the country. And he's a grateful American because he was given asylum here, and he did not like seeing this. And he has said many times that this Bush lied, people died thing really brought back a heavy deja vu of some of the disinformation campaigns of attacks on leaders in the Soviet bloc when the new leader came on.
Well, yeah, but what would he say today with the attacks on this administration, and most of it justified?
What can you say? It goes around, comes around. Look, you're going to find that we are awash in information in the information, the internet age. There's every possible type of information is there. What's in short supply is truth, and the whole this administration, there has been, to me, from my perspective, George, it's been steeped in disinformation, going by our textbook definition of information laundering.
Right.
Regardless of what your politics are, if you agree or disagree with Barack Obama, the fact is that the so-called mainstream media did launder his background. You may agree with his background and his viewpoint. Many people think that's where a progressive left, where we should be going in this country. That's fine if you honestly say that. I believe in what he stands for. But the media did not do that. They came out and basically hid his very, very unabashedly, radical background for the preceding 30 years, basically. And they hid that in order to get him elected. And so that fits our classical definition of either sin of commission or omission. People assume if there's something important, the media will tell them. And sometimes they don't.
No, a lot of times they don't, David. That is one of the new age surprises that people are going to have to recognize and deal with, is that a lot of the media just takes something spoon-fed, and they just don't know what they're feeding back to the people. We're going to be back in a moment, taking this break as we talk about disinformation. Believe it or not, was it involved in JFK's assassination? Let's get into that, too, on Coast to Coast AM. Of course, we are talking disinformation, very special book, and we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back with David Kopelian, of course, from WND, and Ron Rislock. He's a professor, of course, of law at the University of Mississippi, and he is the co-author of the book Disinformation. David, one of the managing editors and publishers as well. Both you, Ron, and David, let's begin with the Kennedy assassination of 1963. You've devoted several chapters to the Kennedy assassination. Tell me what was the disinformation here?
Well, I guess like so many people, I'm 55 years old. The Kennedy assassination always fascinated me. One of my earliest memories growing up in St. Louis was my dad came home early one day and said, the president had been shot.
And I got to stop you right now because I'm broadcasting from St. Louis right now as we speak.
I love St. Louis. I watched the Cardinals lose in the ninth today, but I'm a very big fan of St. Louis. But it's almost gospel among those of us who read all the books and hear all the lectures and everything that Lee Harvey Oswald was a nobody and the Soviets were not interested in him. He was stop for a moment and ask yourself, does that really make sense that the Soviet Union would not have been interested in a Marine sharpshooter who taught himself Russian, emigrated to Russia, married a Russian woman, later went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico and did the fair? Does it make sense that they were not at all interested? It doesn't really if you step back and think about it. And what we show in the book is that, of course, the Soviets were very interested in Lee Harvey Oswald, but the most important thing in terms of disinformation, at the time of the shooting, the Soviets recognized that a lot of eyes would focus on them.
Right.
And immediately they went into an active campaign funding speakers, funding books, sponsoring articles to make certain that eyes did not focus at the Soviet Union, but rather were directed to look at the CIA, question the CIA, question the American government. And they helped publish books, fund speakers, get people thinking along those lines, muddy the waters, but primarily make sure you're not looking at the Soviet Union. And that was a very active disinformation campaign.
Now, when you say they funded money to speakers and authors, Americans or someone else?
Absolutely Americans. One of the first books written about the Kennedy assassination, and we look at the authors there, the folks who spoke, and we're not even certain whether they knew, where the money was coming from, but you can recruit someone without actually even knowing about it. We have some other stories about that, about how Soviet agents would recruit a writer. They would befriend them, take them out to dinner, help, sponsor a letter, contribute an article, and pretty soon that author, that journal, that writer is a reliable outlet for Soviet disinformation. They cultivated these relationships. They cultivated a lot of relationships that didn't even pan out. One of the things about disinformation is it's not just, okay, we're taking one guy and we're going to do this. You take 100 folks and you put them in positions where they might pan out. Maybe only 5 of them will pan out, but those 5 that pan out can be very influential. So the other 95, some of them may never have even known that they were sort of put in this situation.
That's fascinating.
And this whole thing fits in very well with the American attitude at that time, because Lyndon Johnson, who became president, of course, was very afraid that any official suggestion that the Soviets might have been involved in the assassination could lead to a nuclear threat from Moscow. Remember, we'd just been through the Cuban Missile Crisis with Kennedy and so forth. So when they put together the Warren Commission, there was really, maybe it was like it was an internal directive, or maybe it was just implicit, but they really wanted a top caliber, blue ribbon group who would essentially put a stamp of approval on that this was a lone gunman. There was no Soviet connection because they were afraid of a nuclear war with the Soviets.
Well, was there a Soviet connection?
We go into it in somewhat. It looks like the Soviets were interested in Lee Harvey Oswald in perhaps training him to be a shooter, to do something like this. They probably did not order the shooting at the time it took place, but he may have thought they wanted him to do it. He may have thought he was acting within what he had been trained to do and what his assignment would be. So we're not saying that it was carried out at the request of the Soviet Union, the KGB, but we are saying that they were interested in him, they trained him to do something like this, and what he did, he thought he probably was doing. He thought he was doing something that they would have wanted him to do.
What about Castro? Did his name come up at all from the Lieutenant General?
Well, it comes up a little bit because Pachepa actually knew Castro. I mean, that's one of the amazing things about getting to know Pachepa is the people he hung out with and the people he knew. And one of the great disinformation campaigns we write about in the book is the cult of Che. How you'll often today see T-shirts and pictures and posters of Che.
Well, he was a hero to people. You would think, right?
Yeah, he's a big hero, and people. I mean, he was a butcher. He was really a bad, evil guy who did horrible stuff. But he kind of had that. He was killed, and he kind of had the long hair, the rebellious look, and it was an active campaign to create him as sort of the modern outlaw, the kind of cool person that the teenagers in the late 1960s, would like. And they cultivated that cult very actively.
Well, they martyred him, didn't they? They just made him seem like a martyr.
Exactly, and kind of a cool martyr too. It's that classic picture.
I think it's amazing. Excuse me. But I think it's amazing how Castro, to this day, has outlived them all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are you going to do? He did. It's one of the things. If you're a dictator, and if you are not overthrown by your own people, you can stay in power forever.
Right.
In the book, Disinformation, what are some of the things that startled you guys the most?
Well, I'll tell you. One of the most fascinating to me, and I think probably to most people, because this is something that we are dealing with today. A lot of people discovered, something called Islamic Jihad, or whatever you want to call it, on early Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001. It wasn't particularly a new thing then, but that's when the most Americans woke up to it. But this is one of the major points in the book, Disinformation, is that the Soviet Union played a major, although really pretty much unknown, role in encouraging today's Islamic Jihad, radical anti-Semitism and terrorism. And I just, to pull one example out, Yasser Arafat, the great Palestinian leader, born in Jerusalem, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Mm-hmm. It's all a lie. Well, the Nobel Prize is not a lie. He the father of modern
we know he did
the Nobel Prize. That right. Makes my head spin around a few times. But Arafat, and this is, by the way, this is known beyond the book. This part is something that is known. Arafat was a creation of the KGB. He was born in Egypt, not Jerusalem. He was a committed Marxist. The KGB destroyed his birth documents and created new ones, saying he was born in Jerusalem, and they convinced him that that what he needed to do was to basically come on and persuade the West that he wanted to be a leader, basically a peaceful leader in exile, renouncing terror and recognizing Israel. If only America would establish diplomatic relations with the PLO. This was, in other words, Moscow is really behind this huge plot to destroy Israel, because that is really what the whole Palestinian question. I remember even Jimmy Carter, who's very pro-Palestinian, years ago he said, the AP report said that he said, privately, I have never found an Arab leader that wants to have a Palestinian state, but publicly they all say it. It was they could not defeat Israel militarily. 5 or 6 wars.
And by the way, none of those Arab leaders ever wanted the Palestinians in their country.
They wouldn't take them in, even Jordan. No. They were too useful as a battering ram.
That's right. That's right.
And so, that's just that's Arafat. But Pachepa and Ron here, they reveal that the Soviet bloc intelligence machinery, this is unbelievable. They planted like 4,000 agents of influence in the Islamic world, armed with hundreds of thousands of copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion translated into Arabic. This is, of course, the most infamous anti-Semitic book in history. It's a Tsarist-era forgery created in Russia. And they dredged this up and they spread this out. This is really evil, to fan the flames of this ancient, Arab hostility toward Israel, toward Jews, toward the U.S., because we're the great Satan and Israel's the little Satan and all that, and basically to sow the seeds of anti-Semitism that would later bloom into, violence and terrorism, basically what we're looking at today.
Yeah, no, you're right. Now with social networking, which is making this even easier, is that being used for disinformation today?
Well, let me just jump in and say one of the points that the authors make is that disinformation campaigns can take on a life of their own. It's one of the byproducts of implanting the lie. It's not, this is Pravda, this is Moscow, the Kremlin saying this. It's when you implant it into a Western peace group or into an organization or into the Arab street, so to speak. It can take on a life of its own, so that the disinformation campaign, the active campaign with operatives, back in smoke-filled rooms forging documents, that may long be over, but it continues. You create something, and it takes on a life of its own. So in that sense, the social media and all that, yes, it's more spreading from person to person, something that started off as an implanted lie.
I agree. Ronald, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that, and David's right, that once you implant disinformation, it carries on. You don't have to continually feed it. You create a monster that goes on along the way. However, social media may be, and this is focused a little bit more in the DVD that you can get with the book, social media may be part of the answer, ultimately, to fight back, to begin to have more control over your sources of information, not have to rely upon, the handful of networks or outlets for news. There may be an ability for people to educate themselves and get more direct information and bypass some of the folks who are feeding disinformation or misinformation.
How critical is disinformation today to get whatever you want done, rather than simply tell the truth?
Well, I mean, I would hope that it's not at all critical, and it shouldn't have to be. Disinformation is a bad thing. disinformation is along with misinformation. I mean, it's lying to accomplish political goals, but we're seeing it way too much. We're seeing it, internationally. We're seeing it nationally. We're seeing it, locally and regionally, where there's an end we want to achieve, and we'll tell whatever story is necessary to achieve that end. You have to pass the legislation before you know what's in the law. You have to, go along with my plan here, regardless of constitutional rights. We're in a difficult situation in our nation and really around the world, where we have a world vision that many people are pushing toward, and they're not willing to address it and put it up for a vote in a fair way. Rather, they want to couch it and explain it and say, the science is over. We're not going to look at any more science. We know what's right, and this is what we have to do with global warming or whatever. Science is never over. Science always goes on for debate.
May I just interject, Ron? That's a good example. Obama gave a major policy speech at Georgetown University last week, I think, basically saying, hey, this is what we're going to do on climate change and global warming. Who is it who said you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts? He said many things in that speech which were outrageously untrue. I mean,
one of which was that 95% of the climatologists,
97%, I think it was,
believed in global warming. I mean, that's ludicrous.
Yeah. This is simply not true. And the thing is that now this is a presidential speech, and of course everything the president says is news, and so it should be. So I mentioned before sins of omission. You would think that if the president tells a major whopper, or even if you don't want to impugn it as a lie, you just say, look, he was totally wrong in this statement in his speech. Let's do it that way. You'd think that, the big news organizations, Associated Press and so forth, would report that. You can report it respectfully.
Absolutely.
It doesn't happen. I mean, it happens in the alternative media. You better believe on WND and probably talk radio and elsewhere. And thank goodness we have an alternative media. But basically, the mainstream that many people still listen to, it was like, wow, the president said this today, and they give you the transcript of the speech, they report what he said. Again, that is, in a sense, that is disinformation that the people hear the media report it, and they assume that if something was a real whopper, the media would call attention to it or balance it with somebody else's viewpoint. The idea that there's a petition out there with over 31,000 scientists that have signed saying the global warming and anthropogenic global warming is not for real. And this is not an internet petition. This is an actual real petition that people have to physically sign. Everybody from Edward Teller on down has signed it. You ain't got no 95 or 97% of scientists or climatologists signing on to this. So, but this is, Obama has learned, because the media have let him get away with so much stuff that he can basically say what he wants, and he knows there's going to be very little mainstream pushback on it, because overall they are in sync with his overall agenda.
And also, though, David and Arnold, let me let you know what's been going on in the media over the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, back in I've started a long time ago, probably way before both of you two were born, and in some of my earlier days as a copy boy and production assistant. But we don't have the kind of news people that we used to have years ago. I mean, we had hard-nosed reporters who would investigate, who worked for major newspapers, who were given weeks to go on an assignment and dig up stuff. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, now it's all instant. We got to get you on. Most of the television people are more interested in the suit they wear and their tie than the content of what they're reporting. Those days are gone now. And, I love the Internet. The Internet has created great places like the Drudge Report and WND and this radio show as well. But by and large, those hard news investigators, the Woodward and Bernsteins, they're gone now. And, that's a sign of the times.
Yeah, one very good benchmark for that is if you watch like White House press briefings where they're actually talking to the president. With past presidents, they were really wild and woolly. You'd have reporters standing up and challenging. I mean, it's the president. Okay, you're respectful, but really challenging the president, boy, no more. Not in the age of Obama, and I'm not particularly blaming Obama for that. I'm blaming the press for that.
Exactly. Let's talk more about that when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Plus, later on, we'll open up the phone lines, and you can join us. We'll be back. And, of course, next hour, we'll take your phone calls as we talk about disinformation. I'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast with David, of course, Kopulyan and Rich, and then our special professor, of course, Ronald Richlock. He is the co-author of the book Disinformation. We're talking about the media and how they're just not as strong as they used to be, and it's quite evident today. I think today, David and Ron, most of them simply take a release and they run with it without really even investigating it. Do you feel the same way?
Well, it's funny that we're talking about the Soviet Union, and we used to laugh at Izvestia and Pravda, which mean, was it truth and news, the old joke? There is no truth in Pravda, and there is no news in Izvestia. I might have butchered that joke, but anyway, what I'm getting to is that a lot of people look at the so-called mainstream media in the USA today and say, you know what, this is an awful lot like a propaganda ministry. It doesn't have a whole lot more credibility than the Soviet media did back then. I mean, you look at Xinhua, which is the giant Chinese agency. They're everywhere. They have thousands of reporters. This is a branch of the Communist Party of China. Okay, there's no pretense of an independent press. That is what they are, but we have a tradition of an independent press, the fourth estate, in the U.S. and more, like you said, take a press release or just take what the administration's take is on it. And that becomes the news. And it's not just, it's a combination of laziness and even hostility toward an alternative point of view. Because especially if you are in the elite media, which I think is a telling phrase for it. It's not just the, mainstream, because it's ridiculously out of the mainstream, obviously. But the elite media, these are people that live and swim, so to speak, in the same waters as the people they're reporting on, and often are in the same social circles, and it's just a big inbred mess. And the idea of the vigilant watchdog on government waste, fraud, and abuse, which is basically what the news organization I serve as managing editor, WND, that's one of our mottos, has been for 15 years, a watchdog on government waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption. That is actually not original to us. That is really the original American sense of what the news media used to do. You mentioned Watergate. A lot of people got into the news media because they watched Woodward and Bernstein, or they watched the movie, and they say, wow, I want to do that. And there's precious little of that going on in the mainstream media. It's all happening in the alternative media, and even with citizen journalists, people like James O'Keefe and so forth, who get out there and take chances and report what the mainstream just absolutely refuses to report.
I kind of wonder sometimes if Chris Matthews was the only one who admitted it, but not the only one who felt a tingle up his leg looking at Obama. There's an awful lot of admiration there, and I think that makes them reluctant to take him on.
Well, everybody should want to respect whoever has been the elected president of this country. But, I mean, you don't have to accept anything or everything that is fed to us. And that's the job of a good newsman or woman.
Yeah, the government is power, and they say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And people say, well, why is government so corrupt? Why is Washington, D.C. so corrupt? Because that's where the power is. Regardless of who is in power, okay, you have to have a really an adversarial press. There's nothing wrong with that. The press should not be friends with the people they are reporting on. It should be a skeptical, I didn't say cynical, okay, but a skeptical, professional press that are the guardians of truth, because power is a dangerous thing. We entrust it to people, but it's inherently radioactive. So that is a legitimate role of the press in a free country, is to be somewhat adversarial toward the government, and we don't have that except really in the, as I say, in the alternative media and in talk radio.
I remember back in 1974 with Dan Rather of CBS News. At that time, he was the White House correspondent. And, he was in a news conference with President Nixon. And after some jeering there, the president said to Rather, "Are you running for something?" And I always remember Rather saying, "No, sir. Mr. President, are you?" And, the people were just aghast that somebody would say something like that to the president. But he was on it. He was on that Watergate story. He was tough, like some of the other news people were of that era. We just, I don't think, have that anymore. They're more interested in, some politician's sex life than his lies and everything else that he does in office. Was the general in shock when the Soviet Union collapsed? Did he ever talk about that?
We don't cover that in the book. I believe that he actually had a role in helping that come down by the pulling away the veil with what he did. So, I think he believed that it had to come down. I think he believed that a strong America played an important role in that. I think shocked is the wrong word. I think it was a fulfillment of what he wanted to see take place, and I think he had an important role in having that take place.
So, and what's going on, Ronald and David, in Russia today? Putin was in charge. He was the president. Then Medvedev steps in. Now Putin's back in again. Is this ever going to end?
Well, that's one of the most amazing parts from the story, I have to tell you, George. Pachepa explained that in every communist country, he said, we had one in Romania. He said, I assume there was one in the Soviet Union. I don't know for certain, but we had a plan. What happens if communism falls? And what you do is you take the intelligence officers and you have one sort of secreted away, and when the government comes back together, you help that one person emerge to come back, to take control, to become the new leader. That person gets other intelligence people around him to become really the new government. And so you have a situation today in Russia where it is, in fact, the intelligence agency that runs the nation. It's not just an important arm of the nation, but you've got former KGB agents all throughout the government. When Nazi Germany fell, we had denazification panels. They went around and found out who was an active, important Nazi. Of course, the top ones, we had the Nuremberg trials and other panels, where they were actually punished. But other people were removed from their high offices. That never happened in the Soviet Union. And so the same people who were running that corrupt regime were able to lay low for a few years and now reemerge through Putin.
And I don't see this ending. This is like handing off the football back and forth until they reach a touchdown.
Right. It's like when I think about this, it's like Ron described it exactly. Just imagine that after the defeat of Nazi Germany, okay, Hitler is dead, okay, that country was turned over to all the Nazi officers, and then they called it democracy, and everybody went home.
Same thing. Exactly the same thing. Just truly unbelievable. Okay, of everything that you have written about in this information, Ronald, where does the future take us? What's going to happen?
Well, I believe the first, and I want to go back a little bit to what David said. David said earlier, Lord Acton's statement about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A leader will take what a leader is given. And the press and the people, if they allow that power to be taken, that power will be taken and corruption will follow. People have to become aware. People have to understand what's going on. we have to hope that social media, new reliable outlets of information, will inform people. We will question people. We will limit the authority, which will in turn limit the corruption. So, I mean, I am ultimately an optimist about things. You know, I'm very concerned about where we are, but General Pachepa is as well. But, you know, the people hold the power. And if the people will assert that and demand full explanations and not allow end runs around legislature and appointing of czars and all kinds of rules like that, refusing to enforce laws duly enacted, it will bring the government back into place. And I think the American people will only be pushed so far. And at some point, I do believe that folks in this nation will push back.
I think they will, too. The bounty, the $2 million bounty on the generals, it's still out there. Who's got it on his head?
There are forces still today who are loyal to Ceausescu, who want to actually sort of revive his memory, who are actively campaigning against General Pachepa, saying that he was actually an undercover agent of the KGB and maybe of the CIA as well, who undercut Ceausescu and did a bad thing to Romania from by what he did, and it's almost preposterous if you look at the facts and look at what happened. But there are folks like that, and in other areas of former Soviet Union areas, there are folks who are loyal to the old regime who will still carry out and who still want to revive that old system. And it's folks like that who are still a threat to General Pachepa's life.
The meddling that creates the disinformation is also extremely dangerous if it's done, like you were talking about jihadists and people like that. If you flame a group of people to the point where they truly understand or believe that you're doing things to harm them or whatever, it could be a disaster. And you literally then have an army, and you didn't even have to arm them. They do it themselves.
Right. And you know, if I can just add to this, we talked about Arafat and about spreading copies of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and all that. That sounds like, okay, that happened a long time ago, and we explained the principle that things can take on a life of their own. But I want to say that this did not stop with that. Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, okay, the head of the PLO and the PLA, the authority there, he was also educated in Moscow at a KGB-run school. Ayatollah Khomeini, the original, 1979, the autocrat, the head of the in Tehran, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, he was also trained by Moscow. And now get this. This is a revelation in the book, is that the top man in Al-Qaeda, is Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was, after the death of bin Laden, he's basically the number one guy. He was trained by the KGB. And we know this from the KGB defector, Litvinenko. This is the guy who was assassinated by the polonium poisoning. Everybody remembers that, him lying in the hospital bed and all his hair was gone. He revealed that Zawahiri was trained by the KGB, or they call it the FSB now, in Dagestan, and he called him, quote, an old agent of the FSB. And Litvinenko said that after this training, al-Zawahiri, this is a quote, he says, was transferred to Afghanistan where he had never been before, and following the recommendation of his Lubyanka chiefs, Lubyanka being the seat of the KGB, he at once penetrated the milieu of Osama bin Laden and soon became his assistant in Al-Qaeda. Now, most people think of Al-Qaeda as like the number one bad guy, multinational jihadist group in the world, and all those Muslims, and yes, there is a lot of insane anti-Semitism, and the Jews caused 9/11 and all that, or the Mossad or the CIA or whatever. Bush did it, but here we have the push coming from Russia, which, as I said earlier, we barely hear anything about in the news cycle since the Berlin Wall came down. We hear about North Korea, and we hear about Iran and China and other countries, but we don't hear squat about Russia. It's just except about Putin, and occasionally we get a little disturbing news that they're always on the other side of all the geopolitical conflicts. But here's something where they have actually been supporting and implanting some of the top jihadist leaders active today in the world.
Well, there's no doubt. And what fascinates me just about that is, of course, as you know, we funded Osama bin Laden to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and yet they're training most of his people. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, that was that was my buddy Ronald Reagan, but, this was a case of, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and there's so much historical work that's been done on, if you go and trace that we help country X in this war, and then the next war that comes around, they're our enemy, using our weapons against us or our allies. That's a tough one.
It really is. Tell me about the 2-hour disinformation documentary.
This was the object is the different medium. Obviously, it's to tell the story of Jan Mihai Pacepa's life. It's a very gripping. It's an Emmy-winning movie maker, Stan Moore, that made it for us. It's a compelling telling of his story, and at the same time giving all these examples of these dramatic disinformation campaigns. What was wonderful about that production is that there are interviews with a couple dozen newsmakers. There is front and center, you've got Jim Woolsey, who's the former director of the CIA. And by the way, I should mention that Woolsey, who's a good guy, he writes the introduction to the disinformation book.
Okay. Right.
And he is a guy who actually hangs out with or personally knows and visits with General Pacepa and his wife. So that's at least one person that we know that actually physically knows and hangs out, because he's CIA and it's a CIA protected identity. So obviously the CIA would know where he is. But the movie's got interviews with people like Rachel Ehrenfeld and David Horowitz and General Jerry Boykin, and it's got Soviet dissidents like Yuri Yermagayev and Frank Wolf, the congressman that actually went over to Romania to, at some risk to himself, get Pacepa's daughter, Dana, out of the country. Anyway, it's got a whole raft of. It's got, as I said, Nina Khrushcheva, who is is associate professor in New York, great granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev. So it's a whole confab of maybe 24 really top tier people talking about disinformation and the world. And I have to tell you, and I've been steeped in this subject for a while because of my involvement with the book. This was really an education for me to sit down for 2 hours and watch this. This is like getting a whole history education in 2 hours in a very, very compelling way. So it's a great, companion for the book.
And the venue for people, how did they? The book, obviously, you can get on WND.
They're everywhere. The book is a top seller right now, Amazon, and the movie within 2 days shot up to the #1 selling documentary in the country. So these are new products. They're just out June 25th, so they're everywhere right now.
Will you ever get the movie on cable or something like that?
I don't know. That would really be a public service that has yet to happen, though.
Okay, and obviously, David, if people want to continue following your work and your writings, it's WND.com, correct?
Absolutely.
All right, well, stay with us. When we come back in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM, we are going to, of course, take your phone calls. We're going to get you to become part of the program. It is interactive. And if you need to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, that's very simple to do as well. Just go to coasttocoastam.com. In the far right-hand corner, you'll see the two icons for Facebook and Twitter. Just click those, fill out that information, follow along as well. And then for those of you who are not Coast Insiders, you can join up for that. It's 15 cents a day. That's all it is. You get downloads, podcasting. This program, for example, you'll be able to archive and listen to it whenever you want, maybe even let some of your friends and family members hear. I'll be back in a moment. Your calls are next on Coast to Coast AM. Of course, this is your hour, the interactive portion of Coast to Coast AM. We take your phone calls, and we'll do that when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. David Kapulyan, of course, with us, and Ronald Rislock with us, of course, talking about the book Disinformation. We'll take your calls as well. Ronald, what has been the reaction to your colleagues about this work?
My colleagues here at the Law School, University of Mississippi, have been great. From the chancellor to my dean to just people in the hall. I've been I couldn't be happier with the support I've gotten.
Very good. And, of course, David, WND, very excited about this.
Yeah, well, we're WND has different divisions, and we are a book publisher, so we're the publisher of the book and of the film documentary. So we've had a big push for it. We've it's a big deal when you launch a book, and there's a lot of publicity and a lot of media you do and ads and so forth. So I'm involved in all that. So we're very gratified. We think it's a really very important project to get out there.
Why does government lie to its population? Why do they do it?
Well, I suppose if you have an idea and you believe that you can create a utopia, I can construct a society that will work better because I'm smarter than everyone else and I've figured it out, or a group of us are, maybe not just an individual, and we can do this, and we know better than other people. You can talk yourself into, I suppose, doing whatever it takes to accomplish that goal, and I think throughout history you've seen folks try to do that.
I think you're right. Let's go to Tom in Northport, New York, to get us started here. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, first of all, gentlemen, Russian Americans and evangelicals boycotted Mitt Romney, so I would watch what I say about the Russian Americans. They've been voting Republican for 60 years, and I don't think Polish Americans are big Republicans. But what you said about Putin is not entirely correct, because the Christian right in Russia put Putin in power, and they were the victims of the communists. 30 million Christians were slaughtered by the communists in the Soviet Union. And most of those leaders in the Soviet Union were non-Russian. Stalin and his henchmen were Georgians and Jews.
Well, the book, the authors are not saying that there is nothing good has happened in Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It is acknowledged in there. There have been lots of important trends. Although I will say that most geopolitical observers will tell you that freedom and what we think of as democratic institutions and trends have been on the decline in the last few years under Putin. So, it's we're not saying that it's the same as it was under Yuri Andropov and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, but neither is it become just like, wow, the Berlin Wall came down and now they're our friends. Most of the people in the disinformation movie, and I'm talking about the top defense analysts, people that have been in the government, the highest levels of security clearances and the Defense Department for years, pretty much to a man, including Woolsey, say pretty much Putin looks at America as the enemy. That is a consensus view of the experts that we talk to in our movie.
Did the general talk much about China? Hasn't come up at all yet today.
We don't deal much with China. I think that was more outside of the sphere that he worked within.
Okay, let's go next to Pat in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hi, Pat. Thanks for calling.
One quick comment, one quick question. On Oswald, after hearing one particular detail, I swung around to lots of confusion, but thinking that maybe he was one of these people who always thought he was working for the CIA, but then realized he'd been betrayed by the CIA. And the detail was, I heard that the night before the assassination, on the telephone, he said the Lord's Prayer with a woman. Together, they said the Lord's Prayer. So I think he knew that he was in the middle of something that could possibly go against him. Now the question, on Curtis LeMay going to Kennedy and other people suggesting setting up Castro with disinformation and hitting the Twin Towers with planes, probably with innocent people aboard, as it was done by later on. But do you know what other buildings were going to be hit by planes in that plan? And also, what kind of bombings were they going to do? I heard they were going to also do terrorist bombings like the one in Boston. But what were their targets going to be? And I'll listen on the radio.
I don't know if either one of you can answer that. Can you?
I don't specifically know. There were other plots that were uncovered, that were foiled, bringing down 10 jetliners over the Atlantic, attacks within America, previous plane, hijackings that were planned, not just hijackings, but using them as a guided missile to kill people. But no, I'm not an expert in that to know the specific targets.
Right, and that's not the focus of the book. The focus of the book is creating this weapon and this ideology, and not the inner workings of what happens.
Can I mention one thing that Pat brought up there? This whole idea about the CIA. Look, all agencies, including the CIA, have some dirty laundry in their past going way back. But basically, the CIA is the best intelligence agency in the world, and it has, as a matter of public record, prevented a whole lot of bad stuff from happening. That's just a fact. We need them, and what the authors point out in the book is that some of the targets of the disinformation campaigns, not only the one maligning the CIA, saying, well, the CIA was responsible for the Kennedy assassination, which was put forth and funded by the KGB, but other campaigns have as a theme of basically saying it's the American CIA that's the evil, and we see this reflected in so many films, big blockbuster action. Usually, more often than not, the CIA is the villain. And I would say that there's some of this is a cultural reflection of something that has been implanted in our culture, that the CIA is inherently evil from top to bottom. Believe me, we would not want to be without the Central Intelligence Agency, because there are really malevolent forces out there, and we do want to know about them.
Well, there's no doubt about that, David, but, you're not going to get a lot of support from people knowing some of the things that agency has done when you talk about dirty laundry.
Oh, of course, MK Ultra. I know all about. Yes, like I said, there's all kinds of dirty laundry going back, but you're going back 50, 60 years there. But I'm saying whatever the reality is of their track record, I'm saying it has been deliberately maligned by the Soviet counterpart intelligence agency.
I think they also
make the CIA look worse than it is.
I think they also malign their own. With some of the things they've done, some of the botched things they've done. The Bay of Pigs situation was a fiasco. Alan Dulles never, ever liked John F. Kennedy. And so I think, within the CIA, you've probably got some people there who have done some pretty dastardly things, don't you think?
Yeah, I'm not going to make my career going around and defending the CIA. Okay,
no, don't do that, because it won't go anywhere.
It's got a mixed history. I'm just making the point about, like Pat was saying in her call. Well, something bad with the CIA, and that just had a reverberation of. If you read through the book, this information, you'll see. And remember, General Pacheco is a guy. He's not just like a pundit. he's not even just an eyewitness. He's a participant. This is very rare to have somebody who's there at the pinnacle of the stuff the rest of us can only dream about, what happened with the machinations of the foreign intelligence. And he's saying, yeah, they were explicitly going and attacking the CIA to, if nothing else, to deflect attention from their own, their own debauchery.
And Ronald, tell me about he was Romanian, of course. He wasn't Russian, wasn't part of the Soviet. He wasn't a Soviet. How strong was he in this disinformation campaign?
Well, he was the head of the group that ran disinformation for Romania, and that was a very active organization. It was called the DIE, D-I-E, the initials for it, that ran disinformation campaigns for Romania, but also the way the Soviet intelligence agencies worked was when there was a major project, they would often bring in the satellite nations, divvy up parts. And by the way, that's part of disinformation. You're kind of erasing your fingerprints if you've got something happening in one nation and something else over here. So he would be involved in for instance, trying to place some agents inside the Vatican to get hold of some documents, or he would be involved in some other aspect of a project, or he might not even know the details. Certainly not all the details of the entire project, but he would have a specific assignment. Then the other times he would be working for Romania, where he oversaw everything.
All right, next up we go to Donato in Westmont, New Jersey. Hello, Donato. Go ahead.
George, happy 4th of July. Thanks for taking my call. I had a comment for Ron and then for David. First, Ron, I commend your work on defending Pius XII. I read all about C-12 in particular, which is the General Pacheco's admission to the vast plan, the diabolical plan of smearing Pius XII. And quite honestly, in my humble opinion, that was the ultimate catalyst which led to the Second Vatican Council, which to this day, as a traditional Catholic, I believe, was fulfillment of the communist infiltration of the Catholic Church. I mean, because basically having Pius XII, who we know for historical fact saved thousands of Jews, having him as a bad guy, as quote unquote Hitler's Pope, was using him as this false fall guy, who was able to be the catalyst to these lies of the Second Vatican Council, which quite honestly are that Pius XII was almost semi-responsible for what supposedly happened in Nazi concentration camps, which leads to David. My second point I wanted to make: you mentioned the protocols of the Elders of Zion several times during the show tonight, and quite honestly, David, the fact of the matter is that Bolshevik communism is synonymous with the state of Israel. And the misinformation campaign, the greatest one of all time, is what supposedly happened in these labor camps, where there's no proof whatsoever that gas chambers existed.
Excuse me?
Oh, don't go there. No, now you sound like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad on that one.
Yeah, we know what happened to him. He's out now.
Not only did those gas chambers exist, they pulverized 6 million Jews.
May I just make a quick comment on that? Not to dwell on it, but I lost up to 100 family members, extended family members, in a previous genocide, the Armenian genocide, which is now denied to this day by the state of Turkey. But the thing is that there were thousands of eyewitnesses. This is not something that happened in 2500 BC. We had cameras, there were photographs. There were over 100 front-page stories in the New York Times. The U.S. ambassador to Turkey wrote an entire book about it, Henry Morgenthau, describing what happened. And so I am used to dealing with people saying the Armenian genocide never happened. But even, it's a generation later to say that, well, there were no, Eisenhower required that the Army Corps of Engineers lock down the concentration camps and photograph everything, because they say people will never believe this actually happened if we just clean it up and destroy this. Okay, so he wisely showed, and they led the German populace through the concentration camps. And there is newsreel footage. You can look at it on YouTube of women that are just crying convulsively, and men, heads bowed low at seeing this, because they were required to walk through this graveyard and see what they had been in denial of, because they'd heard rumors about it. So the idea that this didn't happen or this didn't exist is really just disinformation.
You know, I too, David, by the way, lost some family members in Turkey in the 1920s.
Yeah.
When they killed off a lot of Christians too during that entire uprising and scourge. Why do so many people still not believe that the Holocaust occurred? I mean, that is what I find to be so bizarre.
Well, that's particularly rampant in the Middle East.
There's actually sort of an interesting little story there that we touch on in the book. The guy who is known as the author of the play that discredited the Pope Pius XII, is Ralph Holkoff, a German playwright. His best friend, his lifelong friend, is David Irving, perhaps one of the world's most notorious Holocaust deniers. There's a real irony there in that someone who is thought of as sort of an enlightened guy who unveiled this corruption in the Vatican is best friends with an internationally known Holocaust denier, and we examine that a little bit in the book.
Okay, Jason's in Denver, Colorado. Hey, Jace, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for having me on your show.
Sure thing.
Subject being disinformation. I assume you already know this, but misinformation, disinformation, the real disconnect, the difference there is knowledge. Disinformation is an outright lie. Misinformation is a lie accidentally, right?
Well, from the Soviet science of this, it's actually a little more complicated. The disinformation is I'd say washing your fingerprints, making it look like it came from a reliable source.
I think so too. Look, we're going to take a break pretty soon.
There's the difference between the colloquial people say, well, misinformation means like it's inadvertent. It's just you're wrong about something, and disinformation is somehow more malevolent. But from the intelligence standpoint, the way General Pacheco explains it from his experience, government misinformation was intentionally a lie, but it was from the government. The government puts out misinformation. It becomes disinformation when it gets implanted in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and now it's been laundered by the Western. And by the way, it's not just the media. If it's put out by an Ivy League school, okay, and we're teaching our young people this, that is, in a very real sense, disinformation, because it's untrue, okay, but it's not just untrue coming from the lying source. It's been implanted into an institution that your parents are paying $50,000 a year, or you're going into six-figure debt to learn.
And then it takes on a life of its own, because people believe it and they teach it to the next generation, the next group.
Exactly. You just have to let it out there and let it grow, and it does, doesn't it? It festers.
Right. Yes.
Truly unbelievable. Well, stick with us. We're going to come back in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. We're going to take final phone calls as we talk about this information, and then when we wrap up the show, of course, a little Independence Day tribute for all of us as well. So stick with us here on Coast to Coast AM. If you ever need to email me, that's George at coasttocoastam.com. It's that simple. We'll be right back. In our next Coast to Coast program, of course, in addition to everything we do, we're going to have open lines just for you. And I'll be back in a moment as we take final calls here, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. We talk about disinformation, and like we talked, it's not really a science, but it's very well methodically thought out, isn't it, Ronald?
It absolutely is. And in the Soviet Union, they called it a science. That's why you'll hear me use that terminology, and General Pacheco talks about it in the book. But it's well developed. It was at least a very technical art, let's say.
Indeed it was. Back to the calls we go. We have Jerry in Tucson, Arizona. Hello, Jerry.
Excellent show tonight, George. I wanted to ask your guest a question about if he's familiar with the, what happened was I watched this on YouTube. This is Wendell Stevens has a YouTube, and he gave maybe a 20-minute story about Gorbachev and about Glasnost and about a child that his wife had who said that he was sent here from another spaceship to educate Gorbachev, and he suggested the idea that he start Glasnost in order. He thought it was essential for the world peace that there be democracy in Russia. I was wondering if your guest could comment on that story, and I'll hang up.
All right. Well, Wendell Stevens no longer with us anymore. He's passed on. But when you talk about disinformation, as you both know, we talk about UFOs on this program. Did that ever come up in any discussion? I mean, is government hiding something?
We have not talked about that specifically. Now, I will say in terms of Gorbachev, if you look at how he was portrayed by the Soviet Union, by Russia as it fell apart, very similar to the way earlier Soviet or Russian leaders were portrayed, build them up as great men ready to make business and do business with the West, kind of the way Ceausescu had been built up.
Yeah, in fact, your caller mentioned the word glasnost, which most people think of, they associate with Gorbachev, and you look it up in the popular definition, it means, openness and stuff like that. Well, General Pachepa says, not exactly. He says this is a very old term and it has a much more malevolent meaning, having more to do with, polishing the image of the leader. This is a theme throughout the book, where you have Lenin and Stalin and so on, and Khrushchev, and each leader sort of demolishes his predecessor, and then everything revolves around building up his image. And so, yes, Pachepa talks about when he was the right-hand man to Ceausescu, we're going to have a glasnost. We're going to use glasnost to create this disinformation campaign, again, that Ceausescu is the moderate, freedom-loving communist, a different type of communist leader that we can do business with, as opposed to those nasty, quote, hardliners back in Moscow. And he kind of prefigured Gorbachev, where we all heard the word glasnost. But again, it was the same thing. Gorbachev was, how do we know what this man really was? Time magazine gave Gorbachev its Man of the Decade, rather than Ronald Reagan, because they worshiped Gorbachev, that he was the man that made the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall come down. I don't think so. I think he did what he had to do because he had no choice.
It was collapsing around him, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was mighty good of him to do what he did.
Where is he now? Is he still in the Russian area?
I think he's in the U.S., isn't he? Doesn't he?
I believe he has a foundation. I know my son recently saw him speak in Houston, Texas.
So he may be here.
I think he's ensconced in some think tank somewhere.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That alone is a story. Mike in Fort Myers, Florida. There you go, Michael.
I'm doing fine. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
The whole thing has me very unsettled that we can't even have a conversation anymore and get down to brass tacks and reality. This is all about who you trust and why you should trust them. And quite frankly, when profit and money is involved, you can't trust anyone. I mean, if you start with your most basic advertising, it's a lie, or it's a misinformation, or it's twisting the truth for a point of view. So I don't understand how we can distrust our government more than we can distrust these transnational corporations and American corporations that are going up against something like. Even you guys bought into it. You're like condemning the 97% of government scientists from all over the world, and would take the word of these big oil corporations and coal companies and hire a bunch of scientists and then round up a bunch of names and put them on a list and say that they're on a par with 97% of the Oxford University, the American Academy of Sciences, NASA, NOAA, Cambridge, the best universities in the world. and you're just ignoring them and saying that they're less credible than the. It's like the tobacco company thing all over again.
All right, who wants to react to that? David, how about you take that?
Well, it's just not true that 97% of scientists believe in anthropogenic global warming. Many, it's two different things. Global warming, which they now call climate change because just as often the temperature goes down, but the idea that man is causing this, and to extend it a bit further, the idea that even if man is causing it, that you can spend astronomical amounts of money and make any difference. Those are, there's no way you're going to tell me that there is scientific consensus on that issue. I would say the scientific consensus is that it's symbolic and political, and that even if we go and do, let's say we implement what Barack Obama would like us to do in terms of, greenhouse gases and all that, I have to tell you, if Russia, which spans, 10 or 11 time zones, and China, and if these countries don't do it, which they will not, okay, it's not going to make a particle of difference that we further grind a country that's already in a state of recession or depression, even further down through taxation and regulation. So it's really a pig in the poke. So, but like your point about advertising is a lie. People expect, in a sense, to be manipulated when they watch advertising. It's clearly a commercial interest. You watch a 30-second or a 60-second advertising spot, somebody's trying to play with your brain. We've gotten used to that since the 1950s or 60s. We understand that about advertising. What's really important is to see the lies that are in the guise of telling the truth, like when the news media say, look, this is fair and balanced, we're professional journalists, we're reporting this, and what they've really done is been very uncritical about their source, but because they have an affinity for the viewpoint of that source, they take it and they run with it, and it really deceives a whole nation of people. That's very important to expose, and that's what I'm interested in, and that is a lot of what disinformation goes to.
Well, and I set an example, my late father, if I were to tell him, had I had the opportunity to, of what the NSA was doing and this and that, I don't think he would have believed me. That generation believed everything that government gave them.
It's true. I would say before, you can pick your benchmark, but let's say before Kennedy was assassinated, there was basically an era of naivete and trust in government, trust in the media. You go down to the supermarkets, and you'd assume that if it was sold there, if it was legal to sell, it must be okay for you to eat. Buyer beware had not set in any area of life, and now we live in a much more skeptical world where, you have a bumper thing that keeps playing is that you don't know if everything. Not everything is a conspiracy, but you have to treat things almost as if they are. Yeah. It's very hard to tell the difference these days.
Terrell in Danielsville, Georgia. Welcome to the program. Hi, Terrell.
How are you doing tonight? I'm
Good.
Glad to be on. This is a fantastic program.
You're welcome.
I would like to say just a few things. Listening to Coast, I'm a fairly new member. I'm going to get out of the box for a minute. We always talk about connecting the dots, and for your two guests, they talk about a lot of things. What about collecting the dots? Have you ever thought about that? All these 7 billion, I don't know what you call them on this planet, cancel the scourge or whatever, walking around, they should carry little pails and collect dots, then gaze upon them. And then when you see a group of dots, remember now, we're not connected, we're collecting. Look at them and make comparisons. We might even learn something. This disinformation has been going on since day one. In fact, disinformation has disinformation. And anyway, I don't want to waste any more of your time. It's really truly a hopeless situation in my way of looking at it. But I want to thank you for taking your time to listen to me for a few minutes.
That's
I
what
wish you the very best and the very best for your program.
All right, Terrell, thanks for that. And I guess disinformation probably has been going on, Ron, since the beginning of time, hasn't it?
There has certainly been misinformation and forms of disinformation, but I don't believe it's a hopeless situation. And I think if you look at this book, what you're going to see is General Pacheco lived in a system, a communist system, where you couldn't trust anybody or anything, and it was all very problematic, really very evil things going on. And he risked his life to come to this nation because he believes in this nation, and he still believes that this nation is great and can remain great. He's concerned about some directions we've been going. He's concerned about what's happening in Washington and in the states and in local neighborhoods, communities, whatever. I mean, he's concerned about these things, and this book is telling people, be aware of what's going on. You can still affect change. We don't have to go to where Romania used to be. We don't have to go where the Soviet Union used to be. We can go in good directions, but you got to be aware. The people are is how you change that, prevent that.
I think so. I'm wondering, is the general a little naive, or does he understand that almost both political parties have been involved in mis- and disinformation?
I would not call him naive at all. I think
okay.
I think he's very well.
He's
very
remarkably astute. In fact, but George, just going to the, is it hopeless? If you don't mind, I happened to get an email today from General Pacheco on the occasion of Independence Day. I'd just like to read you the first sentence. He says, "Dear David, happy 4th of July. I was not privileged to be born in this unique country of freedom, but I am honored to call the American flag my own. Freedom can be shackled but never killed." So this is a guy who is thoroughly a patriotic American, very astute, very concerned because of the background. He came from hell. He came from a very, very dark place, and like most people that defected or made it over here, they say, wow, this is the seat of freedom. Whatever you think about America, it looks really good when you compare it with any place else in the world. And he really does appreciate it, and he does have hope for the future.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Thanks to both of you. Good luck in the documentary and the work, Disinformation. It's a great read that deals with just about everything that's happening to us today. And, of course, we're going to be live with you on Friday night as well during this entire Independence Day weekend. Full live shows for you as well on Saturday. John B. Wells will be with you, and I'll be back with you on Sunday night as well. So lots to cover. And, of course, as we generally do every Independence Day, just a little remembrance in just enjoying yourself because we truly are living in the greatest country on this planet, despite all the little issues that affect all of us. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladasor, Stephanie Smith, Chris Boros, George Knapp, John B. Wells, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM, in the women's division, goes to Sonia Thomas of Alexandria, Virginia. She ate, get this, in 10 minutes, 36 3/4 hot dogs. I don't know why she couldn't finish the last one. Go figure. Last year, she put away 45 hot dogs and buns, and she wanted to shoot for 50 hot dogs this year. 50. I can barely eat 2 at a sitting. Unbelievable. Anyway, throughout the night, we're going to be having special Independence Day programming for you here on Coast to Coast AM. We'll be live again on Friday night. In just a moment, Howard Bloom joins us. We're going to talk about the unrest in Egypt and what it means to you here in North America, in the United States, in Canada. And welcome back to Coast, and I hope you enjoy the start of your Independence Day weekend. Weather in the St. Louis area has been absolutely superb. And some areas, of course, getting pelted with storms and rain, but I hope you enjoyed yourself, and you do for the rest of the week, even though tonight feels like Sunday to so many people. Howard Bloom with us tonight. We're going to talk about the situation in Egypt and why it affects you. And let me tell you something. Mohammed Morsi was elected after they overthrew Mubarak and got rid of him, right? They didn't like him, so they vote for Morsi. He's the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they figure, hey, this is all great for us. Life is good. And in a short time, they got ticked off at him, too, demonstrating. The army decided enough is enough. We want this guy out. It's a different way of politics in the Middle East, okay? They vote for someone, and normally they don't do that. And you know, within a year or two, they don't like the guy's policy, and they protest, and the army throws the guy out. Could that happen here? There's only one person out there I know who can answer some of these questions, and it's Howard Bloom. So we go live to New York. Howard, how are you? Happy Independence Day.
George, hi. Happy Firecracker Day.
You sure? Absolutely.
This has been quite a ride in Egypt this week. It's been absolutely astonishing. But it's a little bit different than it may appear. It isn't just that the people became unhappy with Morsi for minor policy things. And from the point of view of an Egyptian and from the point of view of many of us watching, Morsi started very badly. He hijacked the constitutional process. He wrote the Constitution in large part to fit himself. And he began to hijack the state. He began to take it over on behalf of a theocracy. The Muslim Brotherhood, his group, they're called moderate Islamists, but they are in favor of a state that is run according to Sharia, in which people who are not Muslims are second-class citizens, and in which the top religious figures have a chokehold on the state. And the people who took to the streets back in 2011 and got rid of Mubarak did not feel that that's what they had taken to the streets for, not at all. They felt that, in the words of some bloggers, that they took to the street in order to have freedom. They feel that they are good Muslims. They don't want to be told what it takes to be a Muslim by a bunch of religious leaders who have a very narrow view of what being a Muslim is really all about. So this was very much a demonstration for what you and I would regard as freedom. And it was, the BBC calls it, and believe it or not, these figures sound a little strange for the BBC, but the lies, and I hate to call them that, but that's what they are, have continued. When Obama decided to send weapons to Syria. Now remember, a month and a half ago, he had gotten evidence that he considered ambivalent about chemical weapons use in Syria. And he had drawn a bright red line, and all of a sudden he said it had turned to fuzzy pink because the evidence wasn't sufficient. But when he said he was going to send small weapons or weapons to Syria in the last 2 weeks, he said he was going to do it because of the chemical weapons. Had the evidence changed? There's no indication anywhere that the evidence had changed at all. Why was he really doing this? Because the Syrian rebels, the so-called Syrian rebels, had lost a major city. They lost the city of Qasr. That left them only with 2 other cities, Homs, where they're under fire right now, and Aleppo. Now, if he had told us the position of the Syrian rebels is seriously weakened and we need to do something to shore them up, that would have been transparency. That would have been honesty. Mm-hmm. Now, in the last 2 days, in issuing statements about what's happened in Egypt, he has said, our policy all along has been to support democracy. Several major pieces have appeared, not in the right-wing publications, but from Reuters and AP, that have done a point-by-point rundown of the things that were said by Hillary Clinton, by Barack Obama, about our position toward Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood. And the opposite is true. We have not supported democracy. Hillary Clinton said, we will support you no matter who you are in Egypt and no matter what you do. This was not a pro-democracy policy. Again, if he had been honest in the last 2 days, it would have been a whole different ballgame. But if you remove our right to know, if you remove our right to have vital information, if you turn us from an informed populace to an uninformed populace, you undermine the very root of what it is to be to have a democracy, and that's when and why you might someday see a similar kind of demonstration in the streets of America.
I mean, we saw what happened during the Vietnam War. I did not agree with it. I was in college for most of those years. but I was always concerned about why we were attacking our troops and not the issue itself, okay? The troops had no say-so. They were there. Some got drafted. They were doing what I'm sure they did not want to do. Yet we attacked them. Howard, we're going to take this break, come back, talk more with you about all of this. And I want to take some phone calls, too, with our coast-to-coast listeners who I am sure have some views about this. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back with Howard Bloom. We'll take your phone calls this half hour as well as we talk about the unrest in the Middle East, in Egypt specifically, and what that means to us here at home. I do think, Howard, eventually people in the United States, people all over the region, are going to say enough is enough. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of getting lied to. And I think we're going to start seeing some civil unrest, aren't you?
Well, you saw me a month ago when I really got fed up. It took me something like a year and a half, or actually almost 3 years, to make up my mind about the Bradley Manning thing. You know, I'm vitally concerned with American security because I'm very aware of the international dangers and the dangers of terrorism. But the fact is, something deeply disturbed me about the treatment of Bradley Manning. And finally, I made my mind up 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago and realized that what Bradley Manning was doing was vital to America, that we need whistleblowers from time to time, that we were told by the Nuremberg.
From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to Coast AM. Next hour, it's called Disinformation, how they're trying to undermine us. Fascinating program. Happy birthday, America, 237 years old. Doesn't seem that old for a country, does it? We've sure done a lot in 237 years, and I hope we have many more great things to accomplish. Happy birthday. Throughout the night, we'll be doing some special Independence Day things for you. Here's what's happening in Egypt. They are swearing in one, throwing out the other. The top judge of Egypt's constitutional court, Adlai Mohammed Moussad, has been sworn in as the interim leader a day after the army ousted President Muammar Morsi and put him under house arrest. Mr. Moussad said that fresh elections were the only way to move forward, but gave no indication of when they would be held. Morsi, on the other hand, Egypt's first freely elected leader, is under house arrest after what he says was a military coup. Well, I believe that's probably what it was. The army said that he had failed to meet the demands of the people, and according to all those demonstrators, I would say that's the case too. The upheaval comes after days of mass rallies against Morsi and the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood movement that he comes from. A man infected with the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus has died in a UK hospital. The patient, who is 49 years old, was being treated for kidney failure and acute respiratory syndrome. He was flown to St. Thomas Hospital in London from Qatar in September of last year. There have now been 41 reported deaths from this virus, which emerged last year and is similar to those that cause SARS and the common cold. What is scaring people, as I've mentioned before, is the high fatality rate that's tied into this. A deeply religious Wisconsin couple who prayed over their dying daughter rather than seek medical help were properly convicted of homicide, according to its state Supreme Court. Kara Newman, 11 years old, of Weston, Wisconsin, died in 2008, Easter Sunday, of complications of untreated juvenile onset diabetes. According to the case records, Kara had been showing symptoms of exhaustion and dehydration for more than a week, but her parents, Dale and Leonie Newman, refused to take her to a pediatrician and decided to respond to her illness with prayer, not medicine. Sarah Nash, of course, is the co-founder of the White Light Express and creator of the Cosmic Triage. Sarah, I want to get your reaction to this. We both know that prayer is important, but medicine's important too. Just your reaction to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I was looking at a website recently just about that because, of course, my life is all about prayer. But prayer is just a conversation between us and God. I mean, essentially, God helps those who help themselves. It always reminds me of the woman who says, God, I want to win the lottery. And she gets on her knees every night. And then finally, you know, God appears and says, you got to buy a ticket.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the issue of prayer is not prayer. The issue of prayer is God. And in a world of prayer, basically, we're all equal in the sense that each of us is just a unique person with a unique perspective on the world and a member of a class of one.
See, I'm not going to take prayer away from this family in Wisconsin, but I think what they should have done, what I would have done as a parent, I would have sought immediate medical attention, trying to get the best attention for my child, and prayed like crazy while that was going on.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, like I said, God helps those who help themselves, and I mean, there's no cure for stupid.
No, not at all. Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah's website, of course, whitelightexpress.org. Part of our Twitter feed at coasttocoastam.com. The herbal stimulant KHAT, K-H-A-T, is to be banned by the UK government against the advice of its own advisory council on the misuse of drugs. I'm mentioning this story because a lot of nations, of course, including the United States and Canada, have already banned this supplement. It is treated as a Class C drug, like in anabolic steroid or a ketamine. The KHAT, K-H-A-T, has been known to cause all kinds of problems, a serious risk, they say. But according to, again, the advisory council, they're saying, no, there's nothing wrong with it, but it is going to be banned by the government in the United Kingdom. You know, it costs almost twice as much to live in New York City as it does in Marshall County, Mississippi, according to figures just published by the Economic Policy Institute. The average cost of modest living for an American family of four in the United States can be found in Newaygo County, Michigan, where $63,000 covers food, transportation, housing, child care, health care, and taxes, but no extras such as vacations, eating out, or savings. In New York, the same lifestyle costs $93,500, and in Mississippi, it can be had for $48,000. Let's get the reaction to this from Mish Shedlock, the registered investment advisor. Mish, on this Independence Day, not a lot of people are financially independent, are they?
No, not a lot of people. You know, maybe 10% are, actually a couple of percent are really well off. Another 10% are okay. Another 15% are marginal, and everyone else is living day to day. That's essentially what it boils down to. Yet, you know, I have to say, you know, speaking of the cost of living, which is what the focus of this seems to be, I go into the grocery store, and actually I see that food prices have stabilized. But I also see that weather conditions are actually reasonable for growing corn and soybeans and wheat and oats and, you know, whatever here in the Midwest. Yet I look at the price of oil, George, and it's $101 a barrel. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, okay, what's next in Egypt? What's next in the Mideast? And how does that translate into the price of gas and the price of heating? And we look at the price of education, and we look at all of these other things. So we can weigh the CPI, various measures, various ways, but it's all going to come down to energy, and it's going to come down to jobs. And we look at the government trying to promote jobs. All I see, George, is increased speculation in the financial markets, in commodities, in agricultural goods. So where are we going? We got a jobs report out tomorrow. Maybe we should check back in then and see what's happening.
We'll be here, Mish. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your Independence Day weekend. Okay, ladies, do you want to know the shoes that men hate when you wear them the most? Might as well let you know, according to a poll, it's those wedge shoes that they hate, according to this poll. Just thought you'd want to know. Okay, the hot dog eating contest, the 2013 Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest winner.
They call this the biggest political event in world history.
Well, it's one of the big ones, you know, and you look at Syria where he's fighting and killing and, you know, murdering his own people. That's another one, Howard, that should have just left. But let me ask you this question, because as a politician, Morsi made all these promises, and then as soon as he got in, as you just mentioned, he didn't do any of them. He lied to the people.
Grab all the marbles.
He lied to the people. Look, it happens here in America, too, where a politician makes all these pre-campaign promises, gets elected, and then look at all the strange things that happen once that person's in office. So the $64,000 question to you, Mr. Bloom, is, can that kind of an uprising happen here?
In a way, it certainly can. Remember, before this happened, something that wasn't publicized in the United States was that a youth group called Tamarod, which started only in April, gathered 22 million signatures. That's a quarter of the population of Egypt, 22 million. According to some bloggers, and it's been quoted widely in the press, 33 million people took to the streets. 33 million is 40% of the population of Egypt. Do we have any similar reason to be dissatisfied? Well, you know me. I'm a Democrat. I'm a very faithful Democrat. I've been very, very faithful and loyal to Barack Obama. I've defended him against all kinds of strange charges from my friends on the right. And yet, within the last month, I've become utterly disgusted with him. Why? Because he made certain campaign promises. He promised us honesty. He promised us transparency. Meanwhile, Bradley Manning released 630,000 secret documents. Is that an indictment of Bradley Manning, or is that an indictment of us for keeping 630,000 documents in the last 2 years secret from the American public?
That's
right. Then came the Edward Snowden incident, and it turned out that not only are we keeping vital facts secret from the American public, we're also spying on the American public and on the public worldwide. Now, there are certain justifications for this, but in the end, there's a Constitution, and the Constitution is based on the idea that a democracy can only exist when you have an informed populace, informed individual citizens. Every third day, an article comes out in the New York Times that quotes extensively from the documents that were released by Bradley Manning. And the quotes from those documents give vital insights that have nothing to do with whether you and I are going to be blown up by a terrorist.
I agree. Well, see, Howard, here's my take. I think what the president should have done, and this is the public relations mistake he has made that could cost, a 2016 Democrat the presidential seat. And that is, he should have said, folks, let me tell you about terrorism. You saw what happened on 9/11. You know what's out there. You know there are some people out there that hate our guts. And this is what we're going to do about it. We're going to monitor internet chatter worldwide. We're going to monitor text messaging. We're going to monitor some phone calls. And we may end up monitoring you because it's all inclusive. But we're not interested in you. We're interested in terror. We're interested in these people who want to kill you. And that's the plan. What would have happened had he come out and said that from the get-go?
Well, that's called transparency. That's called honesty. That's what we were promised in the election campaigns that Barack Obama ran, campaigns I believed in and got very excited by. And that would have changed things dramatically. But only in the last 2 weeks